The pearl clasp broke before the Duke spoke her name, and for the rest of her life, Miss Frances Wraxley would remember the tiny sound more clearly than the gasps that followed. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was a soft, treacherous snap beneath her gloved fingers, a thread giving way inside her late mother's prayer book, and then one small pearl bead slipped free, struck the polished altar step, and rolled into the path where she had been meant to become a duchess. England, April 1816, had offered a morning of impossible brightness. The chapel near Mayfair glowed with beeswax candles, white ribbons, spring flowers, and the restrained murmur of guests, who understood that noble marriages were not made for romance first. They were made of settlement, lineage, influence, and promises, written long before the bride had learned what promises could cost. Frances had known this since childhood. She had been 8 years old when her father, Sir Clement Wraxley, told her that she had been promised to House Elvington. She had not understood the word duchy then. She had understood only that her mother had fastened this same prayer book with a pearl clasp and whispered, "Hold yourself with dignity, my darling. No title can give you that, and no title may take it away." Her mother had died before Frances was old enough to ask whether dignity could keep a heart from breaking. Now Frances stood at the altar in a gown of ivory silk that had been altered twice to conceal how little Sir Clement wished to spend before the Daneford settlement was signed. Her veil rested lightly over her hair. Her hands were steady because she had trained them to be steady. In the first pew, her younger sister Flora sat with her head bowed beneath a bonnet trimmed in white silk roses, too bridal for a sister, too triumphant for prayer. Frances had noticed. She had noticed the way Flora's lashes did not tremble, the way Sir Clement checked the chapel door every few breaths, the way Lady Mariscote leaned toward a neighbor as though already tasting tomorrow's gossip. Frances noticed everything. It was the only power left to women who were expected to obey. The Duke of Daneford had not yet arrived. That, too, everyone noticed. A duke might be late and call it importance. A bride might be late and call it ruin. Frances kept her gaze on the altar cloth, where embroidered lilies curved around a silver cross. She told herself that His Grace, Lucian Elvington, was a man of precision. If he was late, there must be a reason. She had met him only a handful of times since childhood, always under supervision, always with the restraint expected of two people, joined more by family arrangement than by feeling. He had been courteous, formal, and cool enough to make London call him proud. Yet once, at a winter musicale, he had paused when Frances answered a foolish remark about estate schools with more honesty than charm. He had looked at her then as if she had interrupted a room full of rehearsed music with one true note. It had been nothing. It had been enough for a foolish part of her to hope that duty, given time, might become kindness. The chapel door opened. A hush passed through the pews. Lucian Elvington, Duke of Daneford, entered without the relaxed certainty of a bridegroom. He was tall, dark-haired, impeccably dressed, and so controlled that his agitation appeared only in the severity of his mouth and the pallor beneath his cheekbones. He did not look at the guests. He did not look at Flora. For one moment, he looked at Frances's hands. She felt his gaze settle on the prayer book clasp, on her fingers curved too tightly around the pearl edge. Something in his expression changed. Not softened, not yet. It sharpened, as though pain had found the one place he had not prepared to defend. Sir Clement rose halfway from the pew and gave a smile that belonged more to bargaining tables than chapels. "Your Grace," he murmured, just loudly enough for those nearby to hear. We feared some unfortunate delay. Lucian inclined his head with all the elegance of a blade being drawn. There has already been an unfortunate delay, Sir Clement. The clergyman shifted uneasily. Lady Mariscote's fan paused in mid-air. Frances's breath remained even, but the clasp bit into her glove. Lucian came to stand before her. There should have been a question in his eyes. There should have been even the smallest private appeal from one human being to another, before public ceremony swallowed them both. Instead, he held himself like a man, obeying a sentence he despised. "Miss Wraxley," he said. "Not Frances. Not my intended, Miss Wraxley." A cold line opened through the chapel. "Your Grace," she answered. Her voice did not fail her. Later, she would be grateful for that. In the moment, she felt only the unnatural stillness of every head turned toward them. Lucian's eyes flickered again to the prayer book. "I cannot proceed with this marriage." The words did not strike like thunder. Thunder allowed a person to startle. These words entered the room quietly and removed the floor beneath Frances's feet. Behind her, someone inhaled sharply. Lady Mariscote whispered something that might have been a prayer if she had ever prayed for anyone's mercy but her own. Sir Clement stood fully now. "Your Grace, this is a chapel. I am aware. Before witnesses. That is why I speak before them." Frances heard Flora's skirts rustle, not in shock, in readiness. The knowledge reached her before the sight did. When Flora stepped from the first pew, she did so with her veil already loosened and her white silk gloves buttoned to perfection. She moved as a girl summoned, not startled. She stopped a little behind Lucian, her eyes lowered, her cheeks flushed with a delicate imitation of distress. The chapel understood before Frances permitted herself to understand. The Duke had not merely refused the bride. Another had been prepared. Her own sister had been prepared. The clasp snapped. Frances looked down. One pearl bead rolled away from the broken hinge, slow and bright against the stone. It came to rest near Lucian's polished shoe. His gaze followed it. For the first time that morning, his composure faltered. Only a fraction. Only enough for Frances to see that he had expected tears, perhaps anger, perhaps a scene that would make his decision easier to survive. She gave him none. Sir Clement's voice cut in, low and urgent. "Flora, come forward. His Grace has been placed in an impossible position, but Providence has not abandoned either family." Providence, Frances thought. How comfortably men named their arrangements after God. The clergyman looked as though he would rather be buried beneath the chapel floor than continue. "Sir Clement, I cannot simply." "The settlements may be amended," Sir Clement said. "The families remain agreed in principle." Lucian turned his head. "No vows will be spoken today." Flora's face changed so quickly that only Frances, who had watched her sister all her life, saw the panic beneath the wounded innocence. "Your Grace," Flora said, softly, "I thought, after what you were shown." "What I was shown," Lucian replied, "is precisely why nothing further will be done in haste." Frances should have asked what he meant. She should have demanded the evidence, the accusation, the shape of the lie that had replaced her. But the chapel had become a theatre, and she would not perform her own ruin for Lady Mariscote's satisfaction. She bent, gathered the prayer book against her breast, and felt the broken clasp hang loose beneath her thumb. Her mother's little pearls trembled against the cover like a row of unshed tears. Lucian moved as if to stoop for the fallen bead, then stopped. Perhaps he remembered he had no right. Perhaps he was learning it too late. Frances lifted her chin and looked at him fully. For years, she had imagined that the first time she stood this close to the Duke at the altar, she would feel fear of the future. She had not imagined the future would step aside and let humiliation take its place. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," she said, each word clear enough to reach the last pew. "I appear to be standing where I am no longer required." A murmur trembled through the chapel. Lucian's face tightened. "Miss Wraxley." "Don't," she said softly, and because it was soft, the word carried. His hand stilled at his side. Frances turned before anyone could offer help. Help would have finished what cruelty had begun. She walked down the aisle alone, past women who lowered their eyes too late, past gentlemen pretending not to stare, past Lady Mariscote's parted lips and Flora's frightened triumph. At the chapel door, she paused only once, not to look back at Lucian, not to look at her father. She looked at the altar step where the pearl bead still lay, small and shining, separated from the thing that had held it all these years. Then she opened the door and stepped into the white April morning, carrying the broken prayer book in both hands. Behind her, as the chapel swallowed its own silence, Flora's voice reached Lucian in a whisper Frances was not meant to hear. "The proof is already in your hand, Your Grace." The chapel did not recover when Frances left it. It merely learned how to breathe again in smaller, uglier sounds. A fan snapped shut. A gentleman coughed into his glove. Somewhere near the rear pew, a young woman whispered, "Poor Miss Wraxley," with the particular sweetness of a person who had never been poor in anything but imagination. Lucian heard all of it. He heard Flora's last words most clearly. "The proof is already in your hand, Your Grace." He looked down. His hand was empty except for the folded vellum that had arrived less than an hour before the ceremony, sealed with old Daneford wax and bearing the claim that Frances Wraxley had, years earlier, renounced the childhood promise between their houses. Yet the object that held him motionless was not the vellum. It was the single pearl bead lying near his shoe, round and pale against the chapel stone. A ridiculous thing. A broken ornament, a fragment too small to matter in any settlement, any inheritance, any negotiation between families. And still, when Frances had walked away and left it there, the bead had seemed less like a trifle than a witness. Sir Clement Wraxley stepped into the aisle with the brisk impatience of a man trying to close a bargain before the other party read the terms. "Your Grace, the difficulty has been made plain, painful, naturally, but plain. My younger daughter has always understood the obligations of family. Flora is prepared to repair what Frances has made impossible." Flora lowered her lashes. Her face held that tender shine society mistook for innocence because it was pretty enough to flatter the lie. "Papa, please," she murmured. "This isn't the time to speak so harshly of Frances." The words were gentle. Their effect was not. They made Frances absent and guilty at once. Lucian bent and picked up the pearl bead before Sir Clement's polished shoe could move nearer to it. The chapel watched him do it. He felt the absurdity of a duke stooping for a bride's broken clasp while her father arranged a substitute behind him, but he did not put the bead down. "There will be no marriage today," he said. Sir Clement's mouth tightened. "Surely your Grace cannot intend to leave both families exposed before half of London." "I intend not to marry the wrong woman in order to spare the right people. Discomfort." Flora lifted her head too quickly. "The wrong woman?" For the first time, her voice lost its softness. Lucian turned to her. He had believed, when he entered the chapel, that she was the injured sister. The vellum had suggested as much. The note accompanying it had been discreet, mournful, and precise. Miss Frances Wraxley, it claimed, had privately rejected the Daneford promise. When she grew old enough to resent being bartered, her family, wishing to avoid dishonor, had concealed her change of heart until a suitable substitution could preserve both houses. It had sounded distasteful. It had also sounded possible. Many women were handed futures they had not chosen. Many learned to smile at the bargain. Lucian had told himself he was respecting Frances' alleged refusal by not binding her to him. He had told himself that choosing Flora was practical mercy. Then Frances had stood before him in bridal white, holding that old prayer book as if it were the last honest thing in the room. And no guilty woman had ever looked less relieved to be released. "No vows will be spoken until Mr. Holberry has examined every paper placed before me," Lucian said. "Every paper," Sir Clement repeated. "This is an insult." "No," Lucian said. "This is restraint." A slight movement passed through the guests. Restraint was not the word they had expected. Scandal, yes. Betrayal, perhaps, but restraint suggested that something worse had been prevented, and that made the room lean closer. Lady Mariscote rose with an expression of delicate distress, sharpened by appetite. "Your Grace, one must admire caution, but the young lady has already suffered embarrassment enough." Lucian looked at her. "Which young lady?" The fan in her hand stopped. "I beg your pardon. You spoke as if there were only one." Silence answered him. Flora's cheeks flushed. Sir Clement took one step toward Lucian and lowered his voice. "Your Grace, you have been shown Frances's own renunciation. You know what she did. I know what I was shown." Lucian held up the folded vellum just enough for those nearest to see the old blue wax. "I do not yet know who made it." Sir Clement's face changed so swiftly that Lucian would have missed it if he had not spent years watching men conceal panic beneath politics. It was there and gone. "That seal is yours." "The wax is Daneford wax," Lucian said. "That is not the same as truth." Flora's eyes glistened. Frances always was proud. She hated being promised. She said once that she would rather be poor than owned. "That sounds like a sensible objection to being owned," Lucian replied. Flora stared at him. The sentence had escaped before he could weigh it. But once spoken, he did not regret it. Something in Frances's parting words had lodged under his ribs. "I appear to be standing where I am no longer required." She had not sounded proud. She had sounded erased. The clergyman cleared his throat with visible misery. "Your Grace, should the guests be dismissed?" "Yes," Lucian said, "with my apology for bringing private uncertainty into a public sacrament." Sir Clement seized on the admission. "Then you acknowledge your responsibility." Lucian folded the vellum again. "I acknowledge more than you will enjoy, Sir Clement, when I understand the matter fully." Lady Mariscote's brows rose. Around her, guests began to stand with the careful confusion of people desperate to leave and equally desperate to remain near enough to hear. Flora stepped closer to Lucian, not enough to breach propriety, enough to claim the picture. "Your Grace," she said quietly now, "I'm sorry for all this. Frances should have told you herself. She doesn't like to be thought ungrateful." Lucian looked down at the pearl bead in his gloved palm. It was smooth, warm now from his hand, and impossibly small. "Miss Flora," he said, "if your sister refused me, she was entitled to say so. If she did not, then someone has used her silence with remarkable confidence." Flora's lips parted. Before she could answer, Sir Clement spoke over her. "My elder daughter is overwrought. She has always been reserved to the point of concealment. It is not falsehood to protect her from the consequences of her own uncertainty." "You are very eager to call silence consent when it profits you," Lucian said. The words landed hard. Sir Clement's face darkened. Lady Mariscote inhaled as if she had just been handed the opening line of a scandal sheet. Lucian closed his fingers around the pearl bead and turned to the clergyman. The ceremony is ended. No announcement regarding Miss Flora Wraxley is to be made by my authority. If any person claims otherwise, they do so falsely. Flora went pale beneath her pretty flush. But your grace, London has seen. London has seen too much already. He bowed to the altar, then to the room, because forms mattered most when feeling threatened to make a man careless. After that, he walked down the aisle Frances had walked alone. Every step showed him what she had endured under all those watching eyes. No one stopped him. No one dared. At the chapel door, he found her father's carriage still waiting at the curb. Frances stood beside it, not inside it. Her veil lifted from her face. The April light made her look calmer than she could possibly be. One hand held the prayer book against her bodice. The broken clasp hung loose. The place where the pearl had fallen was a tiny empty socket among the others. A footman pretended not to listen. Sir Clement's coachman stared rigidly at the horse's ears. Lucian stopped at a proper distance. Frances saw the bead in his hand at once. Something moved in her face, not grief, not gratitude. Recognition. "You recovered it," she said. "Yes. How careful of you, Your Grace. One must not leave broken things where guests may step on them." He accepted the rebuke because it was deserved. "I did not come to offer pity. That is fortunate. I have no use for it." Her voice was controlled, but her fingers pressed so tightly into the prayer book cover that he thought the remaining pearls might follow the first. He wanted to ask what she knew. He wanted to show her the vellum and demand an explanation that would absolve him from the look she had given him at the altar. Instead, he heard himself say, "Miss Wraxley, I was shown a paper this morning. It claimed you had renounced the promise between our families." She went very still. "I did no such thing." 4 words. No ornament, no performance. Lucian felt them with a force no seal had carried. "I believe," he said slowly, "that I should have asked you before I believed it." Her eyes lifted to his. They were not tearful. That made them worse. "Yes, you should have." He held out the pearl bead, not close enough to touch her. "This belongs to you." Frances looked at his palm. For one dangerous second, he thought she might take it, and the thought disturbed him by how much he wanted that small act of trust. But she did not move. "Keep it until you know what else broke today." The footman opened the carriage door. Frances stepped inside without accepting Lucian's hand, as she had every right to do. Before the door closed, she looked once more at the vellum in his other hand. "Whatever proof you hold, Your Grace, remember who benefited from showing it to you too late for me to answer." Then the carriage door shut. The coach rolled into the bright Mayfair street, carrying Frances away from the chapel, from her father's bargain, and from the man who had wounded her before he had understood the weapon. Lucian stood motionless until the carriage turned the corner. Only then did he look again at the pearl bead resting in his palm. It no longer seemed small. It seemed like the first honest evidence in a morning built of lies. By the time Mr. Halberry reached Daneford House that afternoon, summoned with more urgency than any solicitor liked, Lucian had laid 3 objects on his library desk: the folded vellum, the old blue wax seal, and the single pearl bead. Mr. Halberry adjusted his spectacles and examined the paper first. "The wax is old Daneford stock," he said after a long silence, "but the hand is young. Too young for the date claimed." Lucian's gaze went to the pearl. "And the paper? Vellum of good quality." cut from a bound object, I would say. See the edge here? It was once attached. Lucian heard Frances again. Keep it until you know what else broke today. He closed his hand around the bead, not as possession, but as penance. Find where it was attached, Mr. Holbury. The solicitor looked up, and if the answer embarrasses both houses. Lucian thought of Frances standing in the April light with her broken prayer book and unbroken spine. Then both houses have earned embarrassment. By the second morning after the chapel scandal, Frances had learned that silence could be furnished like a room. Wraxley House had always been respectable rather than warm, a narrow London house with polished brass, dark stair rails, and portraits of ancestors who appeared to have disapproved of happiness on principle. Now every curtain seemed drawn half an inch too closely. Every servant walked softly. Every door closed with the careful click of a household instructed not to startle the disgraced daughter. Frances sat at the small writing table in her bedchamber, still wearing the plain grey morning gown her maid had chosen because any brighter colour would be called defiance, and any black would be called theatrics. Her mother's prayer book lay open before her, the broken pearl clasp hung from one side like a loosened tooth. The empty socket where the missing pearl had been looked strangely intimate, as if the book itself had been struck. Frances had not wept after returning from the chapel. Sir Clement had taken that as proof of coldness. Flora had taken it as proof of pride. Frances knew better. Tears required privacy, and privacy had become another thing her family would use against her. She ran one gloved fingertip along the inner cover, where her mother's faded inscription still remained. For my Frances, who must never mistake obedience for peace. The words had comforted her when she was young. Now they accused the room. There should have been a smooth vellum guard leaf protecting that inscription. Frances remembered it clearly because her mother had once tucked a pressed primrose behind it and told her that promises, like flowers, could fade if kept only for display. The guard leaf was gone, not torn raggedly, cut cleanly. A narrow line remained near the binding, pale and sharp. Frances stared at it until the rest of the room seemed to withdraw. The paper Lucian had been shown had not simply appeared. It had been taken from here, from her mother's book, from the one object Frances had carried to the altar as proof that duty and love had once touched hands. Her breath came in once too shallow. Then she steadied it. Panic would make her careless, and carelessness was what other people expected from a ruined woman. Mrs. Nettle, she said. The old nurse had been standing near the wardrobe, pretending to fold a shawl that had already been folded twice. Her hands stopped. Yes, Miss Frances, come here, please. Tell me if you remember this page. Mrs. Nettle crossed the room with the caution of someone approaching grief that might break underfoot. She had nursed Frances through measles, nightmares, and the long, hollow year after Mrs. Wraxley died. Her cap was a little crooked now, and her face had settled into the lined patience of women who knew too much and were asked to say too little. She bent over the prayer book. For one moment, she said nothing. Then her hand went to her mouth. That leaf was there. Frances closed her eyes briefly. Not relief. Confirmation. You are certain? As certain as I am of my own name. Your mamma had it placed there to protect the writing. She said little hands and chapel damp were enemies of ink. When did you see it last? The night before the wedding, miss. I brought the book from the drawer myself. You asked me to check whether the clasp still fastened. Frances looked at the broken hinge. It did, Mrs. Nettle said, and there was no stain there. Frances went still. What stain? The nurse pointed, not touching. There in the hinge. A bit of blue. Like sealing wax pressed soft and caught where it ought not be. Frances lifted the book closer to the window. Morning light slid across the pearls, the gold thread, the tiny metal hinge. There it was. A faint blue smear tucked into the break, almost hidden beneath the damaged setting. Blue wax. Old Daneford wax, if Mr. Holbury's first judgment had been right. The room narrowed to that speck of colour. Someone had cut her mother's guard leaf. Someone had put old Daneford wax upon a false renunciation. Someone had handled the prayer book closely enough to stain the clasp. Frances heard Lucian's voice outside the chapel carriage, low and controlled. I was shown a paper this morning. It claimed you had renounced the promise between our families. She had hated him in that moment for needing to be told what her face should have proved. Yet his eyes had changed when she denied it. He had believed too late, perhaps, but not comfortably, that mattered less than justice. It mattered more than she wished. A knock came at the door before Mrs. Nettle could speak again. Flora entered without waiting for permission. She wore pale lavender, a colour chosen to imply modest sorrow while doing nothing to diminish her complexion. Behind her, sunlight caught the gloss of her curls and the faint smile she smothered too slowly. "Papa says you are not to receive callers," Flora said. "It isn't punishment, it's protection." Frances closed the prayer book before Flora could see how carefully she had been studying it. The broken clasp clicked uselessly against the cover. Protection from whom? Flora's eyes flicked toward the book, then away. From yourself, perhaps. People are talking. Lady Mariscott says it would be better if you were not seen until everyone understands. Understands what? That you were distressed, that you had changed your mind long ago and then could not bear the consequences when matters became public. Mrs. Nettle made a soft sound. Flora looked at her. "You may go. Mrs. Nettle will remain," Frances said. The words were quiet, but Flora's expression tightened. "You are making everything worse." "Am I?" Frances rested both hands on the prayer book. "I stood at the altar where I was told to stand. I carried the book Mama gave me. I answered when spoken to. Which part made everything worse?" Flora's pretty mouth trembled. "You always do this." "Do what? Make yourself sound so reasonable that everyone else appears cruel." Frances looked at her younger sister, truly looked. Beneath the lavender gown and wounded eyes, Flora was frightened, not ashamed, frightened. There was a difference. Shame turned inward. Fear watched doors. "Did you know before the chapel?" Frances asked. Flora's lashes fluttered. "Know what?" "That His Grace would refuse me." "I knew there were difficulties." "That was not my question." Flora stepped closer. "You don't understand what it's like to be second in everything. You had Daneford before you had even learned to spell it. You had Mama's book, Papa's expectations, every lesson, every introduction, every plan, and you wore all of it like you were suffering nobly under a crown." Frances felt the words strike places older than yesterday. "So you wanted the crown?" "I wanted to be seen, by stealing the place where I was meant to stand." Flora's face hardened, then softened at once, as if she had remembered which expression served her best. "No one can steal what you renounced." Frances opened the prayer book again. Flora's eyes went to the cut line before she could stop them. There, a flicker, quick as a candle guttering. Mrs. Nettle saw it too. Frances did not move. "Who cut this page?" Flora's hand tightened around the ribbons of her reticule. "How should I know?" "Because you looked at the wound before I named it." Colour rose in Flora's cheeks. "You are being theatrical." "No, I am being precise." The door opened again, this time with Sir Clement's authority preceding him like a draught. Enough. He entered in a dark coat, his face composed for command. Frances, you will cease interrogating your sister. Flora has suffered almost as much as you. Mrs. Nettle lowered her eyes, but Frances did not. Almost. Sir Clement's mouth flattened. Do not sharpen every word. It is unbecoming. You will remain at home. No callers. No letters except those I approve. When arrangements can be made, you will go to Bath to your aunt. Time and quiet will restore your sense. Bath, the word landed exactly where he meant it to land. Not a journey, a removal, a polite exile wrapped in concern. Flora looked down, but not before Frances saw relief. I am not ill, Frances said. No, Sir Clement replied. You are imprudent. That is often more damaging. He reached for the prayer book. This morbid attachment to your mother's things is feeding your agitation. Frances drew it back before he could touch it. It was the first quick movement she had made all morning. The room felt it. Sir Clement's eyes chilled. You forget yourself. No, Papa. I remember too clearly. For a moment, the house seemed to hold its breath. Then a footman appeared in the open doorway, pale with the terror of interrupting family cruelty. Beg pardon, Sir Clement. A note has come from Daneford House. Sir Clement snatched it. His expression darkened as he read. What is it? Flora whispered. He did not answer her. Frances watched his thumb crease the paper. Then, with visible effort, he held it out to her. His Grace presumes to concern himself with household decisions. Frances took the note. The handwriting was controlled, masculine, and severe. Miss Wraxley is not to be removed from London until Mr. Halberry has reviewed the documents placed before me. No member of the Wraxley household is to interfere with objects relevant to that review. L. Elvington, Daneford. It was not tender. It was not apology. It did not ask to be forgiven. Yet Frances felt the weight of the words as if a locked window had opened 1 inch. Lucian had not believed her soon enough, but he had written something that stood between her and disappearance. Sir Clement said, You will not mistake that for rescue. Frances folded the note once and slipped it between the pages of her mother's damaged prayer book against the cut edge where the missing guard leaf had been. No, she said, I will mistake nothing again. Flora looked at the book, at the note hidden within it, and then at Frances with hatred too frightened to be beautiful. Sir Clement turned away first. This discussion is finished. Frances waited until the door closed behind him, and Flora's lavender skirts vanished down the corridor. Only then did she release the breath she had held. Mrs. Nettle came close, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Frances, I ought to have told you sooner. 2 nights before the wedding, I passed your dressing room after the lamps were lowered. Miss Flora was inside. Frances looked down at the broken clasp. Doing what? Standing at your table with an ivory-handled paper knife in her hand. The blue wax stain seemed darker now, as if the little hinge had kept its silence as long as it could bear. Frances closed the prayer book gently. Then we shall begin, she said. Not with tears, with the knife. The Wraxley drawing-room had been arranged to make Frances look unnecessary. Flora sat nearest the fire, a pale blue ribbon threaded through her curls and a little embroidery frame in her lap, though she had not taken a stitch since breakfast. Sir Clement stood before the mantel, with the posture of a man receiving a visitor on firm family ground. Frances had been placed near the window, where the spring light made her grey gown appear plainer and the broken clasp of her prayer book more visible. She understood the composition at once. Flora was to be the tender daughter. Sir Clement was to be the injured father. Frances was to be the difficult silence in the corner when the butler announced, His Grace, the Duke of Daneford, and Lady Elvington. Even Flora's needle stopped pretending. Lucian entered first, but not as he had entered the chapel. There he had carried judgment. Here he carried consequence. Lady Elvington came beside him, elegant in deep green silk, her silver hair arranged with the severity of a woman who had long ago learned that rank was most useful when it did not need to raise its voice. Her presence changed the room more than a dozen footmen could have done. A morning call from a duke alone would have been improper after scandal. A morning call with his aunt made the impropriety retreat and manners step forward. Sir Clement bowed too deeply. Your Grace, Lady Elvington. We are honoured, though I confess surprised. My elder daughter is hardly fit for company. Frances's fingers tightened once around the prayer book, then relaxed. She would not let her father narrate her condition before she had spoken. Lady Elvington looked at Frances, then at Sir Clement. Miss Wraxley appears perfectly capable of deciding whether she can sit in her own drawing room. Flora rose, her expression composed into sweetness. Lady Elvington, Your Grace, we all wish to spare Frances further distress. She has been so unlike herself. Has she? Lucian asked. His gaze moved to Frances. It rested not on her face first, but on the prayer book in her lap, on the broken clasp hanging loose from its cover. He looked as if he remembered the pearl bead in his own keeping. Frances felt the memory pass between them like a word neither had permission to say. Then his eyes lifted to hers. She saw restraint there. Shame, too, though held under discipline. Miss Wraxley, he said, I thank you for receiving us. I was not asked, Frances replied, but I am here. A faint line appeared near Lady Elvington's mouth. It might almost have been approval. Sir Clement gestured stiffly toward the chairs. Since your Grace insists upon reopening a painful confusion, perhaps we should speak plainly. Frances's reserve has always caused misunderstandings. Flora, poor child, has been placed in an impossible position through no fault of her own. Flora lowered her lashes. I don't want anyone to suffer for my sake. Frances turned her head and looked at her sister. Then you may begin by telling the truth. The room went still. Lucian did not speak. That was the first thing Frances noticed. In the chapel he had spoken before asking. Now he waited. Sir Clement's face hardened. Frances, no, Papa. Her voice remained quiet. That made it travel further. If I renounced His Grace, why was I dressed as his bride? The question entered the room and took possession of it. Flora's needle slid from her embroidery frame onto the carpet. Sir Clement's jaw set. Lady Elvington folded, her gloved hands in her lap. Watching every face with the calm attention of a magistrate no one had appointed, Lucian's expression changed, not with surprise, but with the recognition of a truth made simple enough to wound. That, he said, is the question I should have asked before I entered the chapel. Frances did not soften. Yes, he accepted the word with a slight bow of his head. I was shown a piece of vellum bearing your name and what appeared to be Daneford wax. It stated that you had, some years ago, rejected the family promise and asked that no public shame be attached to your refusal. Flora pressed a handkerchief to her lips. I never wished it spoken of so harshly. You have spoken of it often enough without naming it, Frances said. Flora's eyes flashed. Sir Clement moved from the mantel. This is intolerable. Your Grace, you cannot come into my house and encourage my daughters to accuse one another over private family sorrow. I came, Lucian said, because a private family sorrow was used to alter a public marriage. The air shifted again. Even Sir Clement seemed to feel the danger in that distinction. Frances opened the prayer book on her lap. The torn place near the inner cover showed pale against the older paper. "The vellum you were shown," she said to Lucian, "was cut from here." Flora made a small sound. Sir Clement said, "You cannot know that." "No," Frances answered, "but I can observe. The guard leaf that protected my mother's inscription was present the night before the wedding. Mrs. Nettle saw it. Now it is gone. The remaining edge is clean, not torn, and there is blue wax caught in the broken clasp hinge where no wax had ever been." Lucian took one step forward, then stopped. Frances saw the effort it cost him. He did not reach for the book. He did not assume the right to examine what had already been violated. "May I look?" he asked. The words were simple. They struck her more deeply than an apology would have done. Around them, the drawing room waited. Flora watched as if the prayer book might speak aloud. Sir Clement's anger sharpened into alarm. Frances rose and held the book out, but not into Lucian's hands. "You may look while I hold it." His eyes met hers. Of course. He came close enough for her to notice the clean scent of cold air, leather gloves, close enough that the memory of the altar returned with uncomfortable force, but he kept his hands at his sides. Frances angled the book toward the light. Lucian bent his head. At the same moment, both of them reached toward the cut edge. His gloved fingers brushed hers. It was nothing, a brief accident, a passing contact over damaged paper, yet both of them stilled as if the room had narrowed to that single point. Lucian withdrew first. "Forgive me, it was accidental, still." The word held more than courtesy. Frances heard in it the beginning of a new rule. He would not take even a page from her without permission. She looked down before the room could read too much in her face. "The edge matches." "It appears to," he said. "Mr. Holbury must compare it with the vellum in proper light, but yes, it appears to have been cut from this book." Sir Clement stepped forward. "Enough. That prayer book is a private family article. Frances, close it at once." Frances did not obey. Lucian turned. "Sir Clement, no object relevant to the document I received is to be removed, altered, repaired, or destroyed. You presume a great deal, less than the person who presumed to deliver me a bride's renunciation on the morning of her wedding." Flora stood abruptly. "Why are you looking at Papa as though he has done something wicked?" Frances was unhappy. Everyone knew it. She didn't want to be bound to you. Frances looked at her. "When did I say that?" "You said once that a woman should not be owned. That is not the same as refusing a marriage. It sounds near enough." Lady Elvington spoke for the first time since sitting. "Many disasters begin with near enough." Flora flushed. Lucian looked at Frances, and the shame in his face deepened because he understood. He had accepted near enough from a paper. Near enough had left her alone in a chapel aisle. "Miss Wraxley," he said, "I cannot undo what I did before witnesses. I can say this before witnesses now. There is no engagement between Miss Flora Wraxley and me. There will be no announcement of one. Anyone who suggests otherwise speaks without my authority." Flora's face drained of colour. Sir Clement's hand closed over the mantle edge. Frances felt no triumph, only a small clearing in the fog. "That protects your name," she said. "Not mine." Lucian absorbed the blow without flinching. "You are right." The answer unsettled her. She had expected defense, perhaps pride, perhaps the cold dignity of a duke offended by correction. Instead, he gave her the truth and left it in her hands. "Then what do you intend?" she asked. "To learn who profited from my mistake. To place the evidence before those who have been invited to misunderstand you, and to begin by admitting that I trusted a convenient wound because it spared me a difficult truth. Flora whispered. Your Grace, don't. He did not look at her. Frances did. Why not, Flora? Her sister's mouth trembled. No answer came. Sir Clement struck the silence with his voice. This call is over. Lady Elvington rose at once, making his dismissal appear like her decision. Then we shall leave before courtesy fails entirely. Lucian bowed to Frances, not to her father first. To Frances, it was a small public correction, but in that room small things cut deeply. As Lady Elvington moved toward the door, Lucian paused at a proper distance. Mr. Hulbury will request to examine the book only with your permission. Frances closed the prayer book, broken clasp and all. He may request. For the first time since the chapel, something like warmth touched Lucian's eyes. Not happiness, not forgiveness. Respect, painful and newly born. That is more than I deserve. Yes, Frances said. It is? He bowed again and left. When the door closed, Flora sank back into her chair as if her bones had loosened. Sir Clement turned on Frances with quiet fury. You have no idea what you are endangering. Frances held her mother's prayer book against her breast. The broken clasp pressed into her glove. No, Papa. I think I am finally beginning to know. Before he could answer, a footman entered with a silver tray and a cream-coloured card. His eyes remained fixed on the floor. From Lady Marescote, sir. Invitations for Friday's charity dinner. Sir Clement took the card. Flora looked up at once. Frances watched her father read, watched his anger rearrange itself into calculation. Both my daughters are invited, he said. Lady Marescote writes that Miss Flora Wraxley must not be denied recognition merely because others have chosen confusion. The room seemed to darken, though the sun had not moved. Frances looked at the closed door, through which Lucian had gone, then down at the prayer book in her hands. The cut leaf was still missing. The wax stain remained. The pearl bead was still with the Duke. The lie had not been defeated. It had merely been invited to dinner. Lady Marescote's dining room was designed to make charity look expensive. The long table shone beneath 3 chandeliers, every branch crowded with candles, every plate bordered in blue and gold, every glass placed with such precision that generosity itself seemed to have been measured by a footman with a ruler. On the walls hung portraits of Marescote ancestors who had given little and expected gratitude for generations. At the far end, beneath a garland of forced spring blossoms, Lady Marescote stood smiling as if no scandal had ever entered London without her permission. Frances entered behind Flora and understood at once that the room had been arranged as carefully as a trap. Flora wore pale rose silk, not white this time, but near enough to bridal delicacy to suggest sacrifice without provoking accusation. Sir Clement brought her forward with a tenderness Frances had not seen directed toward herself since childhood, if ever. Miss Flora Wraxley, Lady Marescote said, taking both Flora's hands. You are a brave creature to come among friends. Friends. Frances heard the word move through the room and leave her outside it. Several ladies glanced past Flora toward her, then away again, as if Frances were a misdelivered letter one ought not open in company. A footman guided Flora toward a chair near the head of the table, close to Lady Marescote's right hand. Frances's own card sat nearly at the lower end, beside Mrs. Vayleigh, an elderly widow whose cap ribbons had yellowed with age, and whose charitable opinions Frances suspected were invited only because her silence cost nothing. Sir Clement did not object. Flora noticed the seating and looked down, but not quickly enough to hide satisfaction. Frances sat where she had been placed. She had learned long ago that humiliation became more useful when observed before resisted. Her prayer book was not with her. It remained locked in her writing desk at Wraxley House, broken clasp and missing guard leaf untouched after Lucian's warning, but she felt its absence like the space left by a hand withdrawn too soon. The single pearl bead remained with Lucian. The thought came unbidden as she unfolded her napkin. She disliked that it steadied her. She disliked more that it mattered. Miss Wraxley, Mrs. Wraxley murmured beside her. One must survive these rooms by discovering what no one intended one to notice. Frances turned slightly. The widow's eyes were pale but sharp. That is useful advice. It is not advice, my dear. It is how widows remain alive after relations finish being generous. Before Frances could answer, a stir moved near the door. Lucian Elvington entered with Lady Elvington on his arm. Conversation thinned, then rearranged itself around rank. Lady Mariscoat's smile brightened with alarm beneath it. Your Grace, we feared you were detained. Not detained, Lucian said. Delayed by a matter requiring accuracy. His gaze crossed the table and found Frances at the lower end. He did not smile. He did not offer the smallest public tenderness. Instead, his eyes took in the seating. Flora's place of implied honor, Frances's distance, and Lady Elvington's name card near Lady Mariscoat, rather than near the woman she had come to support. Frances watched comprehension sharpen his face. Lady Mariscoat gestured toward the head. We have placed you near dear Miss Flora, of course. After such a trying week, kindness must have form. Indeed, Lucian said. He took the card marked with his title, glanced at it, and handed it to the footman. Then kindness may begin with accuracy. Lady Elvington will sit beside Miss Frances Wraxley. The room became very quiet. Lady Mariscoat's fan trembled once. Your Grace, the table was arranged with great care. Then it will be no great labor to correct one error. Sir Clement's face flushed. Flora's mouth parted. Frances felt every gaze strike her. But this time the sensation did not reduce her. Lucian had not moved her to his own side. He had not made a show of possession. He had placed beside her the one woman whose rank could prevent Lady Mariscoat from making neglect look like consensus. It was protection without claim. Lady Elvington crossed the room and sat beside Frances, as if she had been meant to do so from the hour of her birth. Miss Wraxley, she said, her voice carrying, I am relieved. I had feared I would be forced to endure Lord Penmere's views on church roofs. A ripple of uneasy laughter passed down the table. Frances inclined her head. I shall try to be less disappointing than a roof, my lady. Lady Elvington's eyes warmed. An achievable ambition. The dinner began. Soup was served, then fish, then polite cruelty, which required no footman. Lady Mariscoat asked after Flora's nerves. Sir Clement spoke of family duty. A baronet's wife wondered aloud whether long engagements made young women fanciful. Flora lowered her eyes at all the correct moments. Frances ate enough to avoid being called faint, and spoke only when spoken to. Beside her, Mrs. Wraxley murmured the names of each patroness most likely to repeat a phrase by morning. Frances filed them away. Across the table, Lucian said little, but his silence was not absence. Twice she saw him refuse openings Lady Mariscoat set before him. Once when Flora touched the stem of her wine-glass and said, I only hope Frances won't think I wish to supplant her. Lucian answered, a person who does not wish to supplant another is careful where she stands. Flora's fingers stilled. Lady Mariscoat's smile sharpened. Your Grace has a talent for severity. Only when gentleness would make a lie more comfortable. Frances looked down at her plate because looking at him felt suddenly dangerous. Gratitude was a simple emotion. This was not gratitude. This was the ache of watching a man learn the shape of the wound he had made and begin, awkwardly but publicly, to stop others from pressing it deeper. The soup tasted of nothing. Her mouth had gone dry. A moment later, a footman placed a glass of water near Lady Elvington, who lifted it and set it beside Frances without looking at her. No announcement, no concern displayed for the room to interpret. Frances touched the glass with her fingertips. Across the table, Lucian's gaze had already moved away, as though he had not noticed. But he had. She knew he had. The quietness of it unsettled her more than any apology. It was the first kindness he had managed that did not ask to be seen. Lady Mariscote rose before the final remove. Her fan closed like a small weapon in one hand. My friends, before the evening advances to subscriptions, I cannot help acknowledging the courage displayed among us. Families of position must sometimes make sensible substitutions when youthful feeling proves unreliable. We are fortunate when duty finds a willing heart. Flora's cheeks bloomed. Several heads turned toward her. Sir Clement's shoulders loosened, as if the room had at last decided to become profitable. Frances felt Lady Elvington become perfectly still beside her. Then Lucian stood. Not abruptly. That would have given Lady Mariscote a victory. He rose with the terrible calm of a duke who had remembered that rank, properly used, could silence a room without raising a hand. No woman, he said, will be named Duchess of Daneford by rumour. Lady Mariscote's fan opened too late to hide her expression. Your Grace, I spoke only in admiration of duty. Duty does not require substitution before truth is examined. Flora's eyes shone. Must I be punished because Frances is uncertain? Frances heard the hook in it. She could remain silent and appear guilty, or answer and appear jealous. There were rooms in which women were given only two roles, and both had been prepared by someone else. She set down her water glass. If my consent can be rewritten once, Miss Flora, it can be rewritten again. Perhaps next time it will be yours. The words reached the far end of the table. Flora stared at her. Sir Clement said, Frances, that is enough. No, Mrs. Valley murmured, not loudly, but the word travelled because old women were most noticed when they ceased being ornamental. It is not, Lady Mariscote laughed lightly. My dear Mrs. Valley, surely we need not turn dinner into a court of inquiry. No, Frances said. A dinner is far better suited to spreading conclusions without evidence. The air tightened. Lucian did not rescue her from the silence. He stood within it, visibly aligned, but he did not take her words and improve them into his own. Frances saw that. So did Lady Elvington. So, unfortunately, did Flora. Her sister's hand had moved to the reticule hanging from her chair. The little bag was embroidered with violets and tied with silk cord. From its loosened mouth protruded the end of something pale and narrow. Not a fan stick, not a letter opener from the table. An ivory handle, thin and smooth, the size of a paper knife a young lady might use at a writing desk. Frances's heartbeat changed. She remembered Mrs. Nettle's whisper. Miss Flora was inside, standing at your table with an ivory-handled paper knife in her hand. Frances looked from the reticule to Flora's face. Flora saw the glance. In an instant, she tucked the object deeper beneath the embroidered flap. Too late. A beautiful lie often forgot that fear had hands. Lady Mariscote cleared her throat. Perhaps, she said, we should allow His Grace to define his own intentions at a more suitable time. Lucian bowed slightly. My intention tonight is clear. Until the paper shown to me is proved honest, no substitution will be honoured by House Elvington. Sir Clement's face had gone grey with anger. Flora looked as if she might weep, and this time Frances thought the tears were real. Not because Flora was innocent, because innocence had become harder to perform. The room resumed in fragments after that. Knives touched plates. Fans moved. Someone began a conversation about Italian singers with the desperation of a nation avoiding war. Frances sat very still, the image of the ivory handle burning brighter than the chandeliers. When the ladies withdrew before the gentlemen, Mrs. Wraxley leaned close enough that her sleeve brushed Frances's. "If you seek paper trails, Miss Wraxley, ask after attendance slips." Frances turned. Attendance slips. Lady Mariscote's clerk keeps copies for weddings tied to charity patronage, special licenses, chapel donations, all those respectable little crossings of money and marriage. Respectable records are often the dirtiest. Lady Elvington heard. Her gaze moved briefly to Frances, then to the door through which Flora had just passed. One hand closed tightly over her reticule. Frances did not smile. Neither did Lady Elvington. Across the room, Lucian waited until propriety permitted him to bow from a distance. Frances gave the smallest inclination of her head. It was not forgiveness. It was not trust. It was acknowledgement. Tonight, he had stopped a toast. Tonight, he had not spoken over her. Tonight, Flora had hidden a paper knife in plain sight. And the charity dinner that meant to name the wrong bride had accidentally named the next clue. The morning after Lady Mariscote's dinner, Frances discovered that a clue could be more dangerous than an accusation, because an accusation had shape enough to deny, while a clue lay quietly in the mind and made every familiar room strange. Flora's ivory-handled paper knife had appeared for only a breath beneath the violet embroidery of her reticule. Yet Frances saw it again and again as she sat beside the schoolroom fire where Mrs. Nettle had once taught her to mend torn hems with invisible stitches. The schoolroom had not been used for lessons in years. Its maps had faded to pale blue seas and pink kingdoms, and the old copybooks had been tied in bundles near the cupboard because Sir Clement disliked waste when sentiment could be stored without expense. Frances untied one bundle with care. Her own childhood hand filled the first pages, large and earnest, every letter leaning slightly forward as if trying to become respectable before its time. Flora's pages came after, prettier, rounder, more decorative than disciplined. Then Frances found a sheet that did not belong to either order. Her name appeared there 6 times. Frances Wraxley, Frances Wraxley, Frances Wraxley. Each attempt began too gracefully and ended with a borrowed restraint that chilled her more than open hatred would have done. Mrs. Nettle, standing near the door, pressed both hands together. "I should have burned those old books when your mamma died." "No," Frances said. "Paper survives because someone will one day need it." The nurse crossed herself under her breath. Miss Flora was always quick with imitation. Songs, voices, even the way your mamma folded letters. We thought it a harmless accomplishment. Frances touched the false version of her name. It is harmless until someone needs another woman's consent. Footsteps sounded in the corridor. Mrs. Nettle moved at once to close the cupboard, but Frances laid one hand over the copybook. "Leave it." Sir Clement entered without knocking. He had not done so when she was a child and her mother lived. Since the chapel, he had begun entering rooms as though every door in the house were an argument he meant to win. "You are becoming excessively attached to old papers," he said, a habit encouraged, no doubt, by his Grace's interference. Frances closed the copybook, but did not hide it. "I am attached to any paper that has been asked to speak for me." His gaze dropped to the bundle. Something tightened near his mouth. "You will not distress your sister with insinuations. Flora distressed herself at dinner when she hid the paper knife." Sir Clement's eyes flashed. "You saw nothing." "I saw enough to ask a question." "Then learn when questions become vulgar." He moved closer, lowering his voice, though Mrs. Nettle remained in the room. "You mistake your present situation. Daneford has not restored you. He has only delayed the conclusion. London is not kind to a woman who appears desperate after rejection." Frances rose. "Then London should be relieved." "I am not desperate to be Duchess." For 1 second, she thought he might answer honestly, that he might say he was desperate enough for both of them. Instead, he looked toward Mrs. Nettle. "Your usefulness in this house has become uncertain." The old nurse stiffened. Frances felt the threat like a hand at her throat, but she kept her voice level. Mrs. Nettle's lease on her cottage was settled by Mamma's provision. Provisions can be reviewed. So can renunciations. Sir Clement went very still. Then he smiled, and that frightened Frances more than anger. "You have your mother's talent for making principle expensive." He left before she could reply. Only after his footsteps faded did Mrs. Nettle sink onto the nearest chair. "He'll send me away if he can." "Not if I can prevent it. You cannot fight him alone, miss." Frances looked at the copied signatures, at the slanted attempts to become her hand. "I am not alone. He only taught me to feel that I was." By afternoon, Lady Elvington's carriage stood outside Wraxley House, not Lucian's, and that distinction saved the visit from impropriety. Frances was permitted to receive her in the front parlour, with the door open and Mrs. Nettle seated at a distance, sewing with trembling care. Lady Elvington did not waste time on false condolences. "My nephew has placed Mrs. Nettle's cottage under temporary protection through a Daneford leasehold interest adjoining the Wraxley boundary," she said. "It is not payment for testimony. It is prevention of coercion. Mr. Holbury has drafted the language precisely." Mrs. Nettle's needle stopped. Frances felt the words enter her slowly. Lucian had remembered, not her tears, because she had shown him none, not her beauty, because the room had already made Flora the prettier wound. He had remembered the servant her father could hurt. "His Grace is careful," Frances said. Lady Elvington watched her. "He is learning the difference between careful and cowardly." The honesty drew Frances' eyes up. "Does he know you call him that?" "Not in those words. Yet." A faint, dry amusement touched Lady Elvington's mouth, then vanished. "He asks whether you will permit Mr. Holbury to examine the clasp hinge and the cut edge of the book in your presence. He will not remove the prayer book from your possession." Frances was silent long enough for Mrs. Nettle to look up. "The pearl bead?" she asked. Lady Elvington's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Lucian has it, locked in his desk with the vellum. He says it will not leave his keeping unless Miss Wraxley requests its return. Its keeping, not his possession." Frances heard the difference and resented that it comforted her. "He may examine the book here," she said. "With you present?" "Naturally. And Mrs. Nettle, also naturally." So it was arranged that evening under the watch of a lamp, a chaperone, an old nurse, and a solicitor too wise to look as though he understood every current of feeling in the room. Lucian stood across the table from Frances while Mr. Holbury bent over the prayer book with a magnifying glass. The Duke did not touch the book. He had placed a small velvet-lined box on the table, and inside it lay the pearl bead from the chapel. Frances had not expected the sight to affect her. It did. The bead looked smaller in the box than it had on the altar step. but safer too, as if someone had finally understood that small broken things deserved custody. "The bead fits the empty socket, Mr. Hulbury said after comparing it to the clasp, "and there is residue on the hinge. Blue wax. A very old mixture, Your Grace." Lucian's face hardened. "Daneford wax?" "Almost certainly. The same color and texture as the seal on the alleged renunciation." He turned the clasp gently with a tool, not his fingers. If softened and pressed too near the book, a trace could lodge here, particularly if the vellum was held against the clasp while still warm. Frances imagined it. The prayer book open on her dressing table, Flora's white fingers, the ivory knife, wax softened over a candle, her mother's guard leaf becoming a lie before Frances ever reached the altar. The room tilted. She did not faint. She had never considered fainting useful, but when she stepped back from the table, her heel caught the edge of the hearth rug. Lucian moved. Only one step. He stopped before touching her, his hand extended, palm upward, gloved and steady. "May I?" The question held the entire distance between who he had been in the chapel and who he was attempting to become. Frances looked at his hand. Everyone in the room seemed to disappear except the old nurse who had protected her childhood, the aunt who guarded propriety, the solicitor who guarded evidence, and the man who had once wounded her with certainty and now waited within uncertainty for permission. She placed her gloved hand in his. His fingers closed only enough to steady, never enough to claim. The contact lasted no more than a few breaths, but it altered the silence. His hand was warm through the leather. Strong, yes, but restrained by choice. Frances regained her balance and withdrew first. He released her immediately. "Thank you," she said. "You may help me down, Your Grace. You may not carry me." Something in his eyes deepened. Not amusement, not tenderness yet. Recognition. "I will remember." Mr. Hulbury, with admirable discipline, pretended to be fascinated by wax. Lady Elvington looked at the lamp flame. Mrs. Nettle dabbed one eye with the edge of her sleeve and then denied it by threading her needle. Lucian stepped back. "Miss Wraxley, I have traced the old Daneford seal used for the childhood agreement. It remained at Wraxley House after the original settlement discussions because your father claimed it was needed for copies. I should have known that was irregular." "Yes," Frances said, "you should have." He bowed his head once. "I am finding that many truths arrive wearing those words." Before anyone could answer, the footman appeared at the open door with a folded gossip sheet on a tray. His face was pale. Lady Elvington took it first. Her mouth tightened. She handed it to Frances without softening the blow. Across the top, in fashionable cruel type, ran the line, "The renouncing bride now claims her own regret was forged." Frances felt Lucian go still, but he did not reach for the paper. He waited while she read. He had learned at least that much. Beneath the headline, the paragraph suggested that a certain disappointed lady, having refused a great match in private and lost it in public, now sought to regain consequence by questioning papers she had once written herself. No names appeared. None were needed. Frances folded the sheet with slow care and set it beside the broken clasp, the wax flake, and the copied signatures from the schoolroom. "They have moved from pity to accusation," she said. Lucian's voice was low. "I will answer it." Frances looked at him. "No, we will prove it." For the first time that day, she saw anger in him that did not chill the room. It warmed it. "Then we begin with wax, paper, and the hand that copied your name." Frances looked at the pearl bead in its little box. Once it had been part of a clasp meant to hold a book closed. Now it had opened the first honest path through the lie, And with Flora's knife, she said, do not forget the knife. By the 3rd week after the chapel, London had stopped pitying Frances Wraxley and discovered a livelier pleasure. Pity required softness. Accusation required only a chair, a fan, and the right room in which to let a sentence fall. Lady Marescote's subscription room was full before the hour appointed for the Widows' Relief Committee, though no one could have named a single widow whose roof, coal, or supper depended upon the meeting. The true object of charity sat in every glittering eye. Frances entered with Mrs. Nettle behind her and Lady Elvington at her side, and felt the room turn her into a story before she had crossed the carpet. The chamber smelled of ink, lavender gloves, and hot wax. A long table stood beneath the windows, covered with ledgers, folded subscription lists, and small cards bearing the names of patronesses. On the wall, pinned as if it were a matter of parish importance, lay a gossip paragraph clipped from a fashionable sheet. The renouncing bride now claims her own, regret was forged. No names, none needed. Frances saw her own place card on the table. A line had been drawn lightly through it. Not enough to be final. Enough to be seen. Lady Marescote rose with a look of sorrow that had been practiced before a mirror. Miss Wraxley, how brave of you to attend. We had wondered whether quiet would be kinder. Frances removed her gloves slowly. Her hands did not tremble. She had decided that before entering. Quiet has been very kind to falsehood, my lady. I thought I might interrupt it. A small rustle passed through the patronesses. Flora sat near the hearth in pale blue, her face composed into wounded reluctance. Sir Clement stood behind her chair like paternal grief made flesh. Lucian was not yet in the room. Frances had known he might come late, detained by Mr. Holbury's examination of the wax and paper. Knowing did not prevent the old memory from cutting through her. A chapel door opening. A duke arriving with judgment in his hand. Lady Elvington touched the back of a chair, not Frances's arm, and said, Miss Wraxley will sit beside me. Lady Marescote's smile thinned. Of course, though we must discuss whether her name may remain on the widows' list until this distressing matter is clarified. Mrs. Wraxley, the elderly widow from the dinner, sat among the committee with her patched black gloves folded in her lap. One hopes clarity will be permitted to arrive before punishment, she said. My dear Mrs. Wraxley, Lady Marescote replied, we are speaking of reputation. Widow's relief must be above suspicion. Frances looked at the crossed line through her card, and a woman becomes suspicious when others write over her name. Flora's head lifted. Frances, don't make this uglier than it already is. The contraction was soft, human, and devastatingly well placed. Several ladies glanced at Flora with sympathy. Frances understood then how her sister survived rooms. Flora did not strike. She bruised by inviting others to lean closer. Sir Clement unfolded a paper. Since my elder daughter insists upon public discussion, we must acknowledge what has been privately endured. Frances long ago expressed unwillingness toward the Daneford arrangement. In compassion, we kept her reluctance from becoming common knowledge. When circumstances required correction, she allowed indignation to take the place of honesty. Frances heard the words as if from the end of a corridor. Unwillingness, compassion, correction. All the old weapons wore clean gloves. Lady Marescote inclined her head. Sir Clement, painful as it is, do you possess evidence of this reluctance? Flora pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. Sir Clement placed a copy of the alleged renunciation on the table. A faithful copy. The original has been placed before His Grace. It bears my daughter's name and Daneford wax. She now claims it was stolen from her prayer book. Conveniently, the supposed missing guard leaf cannot speak for itself. It was cut out, Frances said. By whom? Lady Mariscote asked. That is what we are discovering. After the fact, a murmur answered for her. Flora's eyes filled beautifully. I didn't want this read aloud. I told Papa it would hurt Frances. You were considerate to wait until a subscription meeting, Frances said. Flora flinched as if struck by cruelty. Sir Clement's voice hardened. The copy states that Frances could not, in conscience, marry his grace. It asks that no public shame be attached to her refusal, and that, should family duty require it, another daughter be considered. Frances looked at Flora. A sensible substitution. Flora's expression flickered. Only for a breath. Enough. Lady Mariscote heard the phrase and smiled faintly. A practical one, perhaps. No, Frances said. That phrase is Flora's. She used it at your dinner. She has used it since childhood, whenever she wanted something unkind to sound orderly. Flora rose. How can you accuse me because of a phrase? You always hated that I was softer than you. You always made me feel foolish for wanting to be loved. The room warmed toward her at once. Frances felt it, the old social tide. Beauty in distress drew rescue more quickly than truth in restraint. Then the door opened, and Lucian entered with Mr. Holbury behind him. Every fan in the room paused. He saw the paper on the table. He saw Frances standing alone before it. He saw her crossed-out name card. Something severe passed across his face, but he did not stride to her side and claim the scene. He stopped at the edge of the gathering and bowed. Lady Mariscote. I was not aware the committee intended to examine Daneford evidence without Daneford present. Lady Mariscote coloured. Your Grace, we examine only whether Miss Wraxley's continued patronage is suitable while uncertainty remains. Lucian's gaze moved to Frances. It asked a question he did not speak. May I enter this? Frances did not answer with warmth. She gave the smallest nod. Only then did he step forward. Uncertainty, he said, is not proof. Sir Clement lifted his chin. Yet you were shown proof enough to halt a wedding. The room tightened. There it was. The wound Lucian had made placed before him, like a blade with his fingerprints still upon it. Frances watched him. This was the place where he could defend himself by allowing her to remain doubtful. He could say he had acted honorably on what he knew. He could make caution sound like virtue. I was shown enough to make a grave mistake, Lucian said. The quiet after that was deeper than surprise. Frances felt the words reach her, but not heal her, not yet. Mr. Holbury placed a small folder beside the copy. The vellum provided to His Grace appears cut from a bound volume. There is reason to compare it to Miss Wraxley's prayer book, with her permission. Lady Mariscote's brows rose. Reason, but not conclusion. Correct, Mr. Holbury said. The wax is old Daneford stock, and the hand requires further comparison. Sir Clement seized upon it. Requires further comparison. Then there is no proof of forgery. Lucian looked at Frances again. She knew what was coming before he moved. His hand lifted slightly toward her elbow. The same hand that had steadied her at the carriage step with permission. But this time the room was hostile, proof incomplete, and his instinct was still to steady before fully standing. Frances stepped back. The movement was small. It struck him harder than a slap would have done. Do not steady me with one hand while weighing my truth with the other. His hand fell at once. You are right. The admission was immediate. It did not save her. Lady Mariscote's fan opened, soft as a wing. How unfortunate! Even His Grace cannot say the matter is settled. Flora began to cry, not loudly. Just enough. I never asked to be chosen instead of Frances. I only tried to be dutiful when she would not. Sir Clement laid a hand on Flora's shoulder. My younger daughter has behaved with grace. My elder daughter has answered disappointment with suspicion. Lady Mariscote looked at the subscription ledger. Until the committee has confidence that no improper pressure has been placed upon the Daneford name, I suggest Miss Frances Wraxley's patronage be suspended from the widow's relief list. Mrs. Varley made a sharp sound. You punish widows to flatter gossip. We protect the charity, Lady Mariscote said. One by one, the patronesses looked away from Frances, some with discomfort, some with relief. The line through her card was darkened. Frances watched the ink cross her name and felt, strangely, not shame but clarity. This was what silence did when dressed as respectability. It did not merely wound a woman. It trained rooms to participate. She picked up her gloves. Lucian took one step as if to follow, then stopped himself. Good, Frances thought, though her throat ached. Let him learn the shape of restraint when it cost him. She turned to Lady Mariscote. You may cross out my name today. Do not grow fond of the ink. Lady Mariscote's smile faltered. Frances faced Flora next. And you may weep, Flora. Tears do not change handwriting. Flora's tears stopped for half a second. Frances saw it. So did Lucian. Then Frances walked out of the subscription room by choice. With Mrs. Nettle behind her and Lady Elvington's silence like a shield at her shoulder, she did not look back until she reached the vestibule. Lucian stood where she had left him, visibly motionless before the table, the alleged renunciation between him and the door. He had not chosen wrongly in the same way as the chapel, but he had not yet chosen rightly enough. That evening, from her chamber at Wraxley House, Frances wrapped the pearl bead Lucian had returned for comparison in a square of plain paper and sent it back to Daneford House by Mrs. Nettle's most trusted errand boy. With it, she enclosed one line, "Find where your wax came from." Then she sat beside her damaged prayer book, touched the cut edge where her mother's guard leaf had been, and understood that the next proof would not merely clear her name. It would decide whether Lucian Elvington had the courage to believe her before London gave him permission. By the time Sir Clement ordered Frances to Bath, the word had already lost the shape of a city and become a cupboard with a lock. He announced it after breakfast in the small back parlour, where the morning light fell thinly over the tea service, and Flora sat with reddened eyes that had been displayed to callers for 3 days, like a certificate of suffering. Frances had not been permitted to receive anyone except Mrs. Nettle. Her name remained crossed from Lady Mariscote's subscription list. The gossip paragraph had multiplied into whispers at milliners, in bookshops, beside carriage steps, and beneath church porches where ladies lowered their voices only after ensuring they had been heard. Sir Clement stood with a folded letter in his hand and the satisfaction of a man who had found a respectable word for punishment. Your aunt in Bath has agreed to receive you, he said. The waters, the distance, and quiet company will do what London cannot. Frances looked up from the old copybook she had been studying. Flora's practice of her name appeared on 3 pages now, some attempts too ornamental, some chillingly close. Restore my usefulness. Sir Clement's gaze hardened. Restore your sense. Flora folded her handkerchief. Frances, it's for your own good. People are saying unkind things. People have been helped. Flora flinched, and for a moment Frances saw not softness, but calculation bruised by resistance. Sir Clement placed the Bath letter on the table. You will leave on Thursday. Mrs. Nettle will not accompany you. Her influence has encouraged your present defiance." The old nurse, standing behind Frances' chair, went still. Frances closed the copybook. Her voice remained calm because rage in that room would be used as evidence. "Mrs. Nettle has served this family since before Flora was born. Sentiment is not tenure. No, nor is fatherhood a license to erase a daughter." Flora whispered, "Don't speak to Papa that way." Frances turned to her. "I have spoken gently all my life. It did not make anyone honest." Sir Clement struck the table once with his palm, not hard enough for violence, but hard enough to make the teaspoons tremble. "You will go to Bath." Frances rose. No. The word was small. It altered the room. Sir Clement stared as if she had spoken in a foreign language. Flora's lips parted. Mrs. Nettle made a sound that might have been fear or pride. "You forget your position," Sir Clement said. "I remember it exactly. I am an unmarried daughter in your house, which means society expects obedience from me and explanation from no one else. That is why I will not go where you may lock the story behind me." "You have no choice." "Yes," Frances said, "I do." She had prepared the sentence through a sleepless night, testing every legal and social edge of it. "Cousin Margaret Annesley in Richmond has written twice since the chapel. She is widowed, respectable, and of Mamma's family. She has offered to receive me. Mrs. Nettle will escort me there today." Sir Clement's face darkened. "Without my permission, with my mother's kin as witness, Lady Elvington's knowledge, and no impropriety attached." Flora stood. "Lady Elvington knows?" There it was. Fear again. Frances heard it clearly. "Lady Elvington knows enough." Sir Clement's voice dropped. "You will ruin yourself." "No, Papa. I was ruined at an altar by other people's arrangements. Today I am choosing where I sleep." The silence after that was larger than the parlor. It seemed to reach backward through every lesson Frances had endured, every fitting, every correction of posture, every reminder that a promised bride must be grateful for the honor of being shaped. Sir Clement looked at her as if seeing not a daughter, but a document that had refused to bear the proper signature. "If you leave this house against my direction, do not expect it to open easily when you regret the performance." Frances slipped Flora's copied practice sheet into her reticule, along with Lucian's earlier warning note, and the key to her writing desk, where the damaged prayer book remained locked. She would not carry the prayer book through London while her father watched. Not yet. A door that opens only to obedience is not a home. Mrs. Nettle brought her bonnet and pelisse with shaking hands. Flora moved closer, her face suddenly young, suddenly angry. "You think leaving makes you noble. It doesn't. It makes you selfish." Frances tied her bonnet ribbons before answering. "No, it makes me unavailable." That wounded Flora more than accusation. Frances saw it and understood something she had missed for years. Flora did not merely want Daneford. She wanted Frances present to witness the theft, to remain close enough that every triumph could be measured against the sister displaced. Frances gave her no more. The hired carriage stood at the side entrance within the hour, arranged through Cousin Margaret's man of business, and confirmed by Lady Elvington's discreet message. There was no dramatic flight, no cloak over Frances's face, no midnight scandal. It was a lawful departure in daylight with a widowed cousin expecting her and an elderly servant for escort. That made it harder for Sir Clement to stop without revealing the force beneath his concern. He stood at the foot of the stairs as Frances descended with one modest trunk. "Bath would have been kinder," he said. Frances paused. Kindness does not require bars. She stepped past him. Outside, London carried on with cruel indifference. wheels splashed through shallow mud. A boy sold newspapers at the corner. Two ladies in a passing carriage leaned together when they recognized her, and their veils fluttered like dark wings. Frances entered the carriage with Mrs. Nettle beside her. Only when Wraxley House began to recede did the nurse grasp her handkerchief in both hands and whisper, "Miss Frances, I never thought I would be glad to leave a house where I carried you as a baby." Frances looked straight ahead until the corner turned and the front door vanished. "I am not glad." Her voice softened, "but I am awake." Richmond received her with grey skies, damp lilacs, and cousin Margaret Annesley, standing in the doorway of a small brick house that looked too honest to be fashionable. Margaret was a widow of 50, spare, kind-eyed, and sufficiently unimpressed by scandal to be useful. She embraced Frances carefully, as if affection need not ask questions before offering shelter. "You will have the blue room," she said. "It looks over the garden. No one will call unless you approve it, and no letter will be opened by anyone but you." Frances felt the words in her bones. No letter will be opened by anyone but you. It was astonishing how freedom could sound like ordinary household management. That evening, after Mrs. Nettle had been given tea strong enough to revive the dead and a room near Frances's own, a letter arrived under Lady Elvington's seal. Though the hand within was Lucian's, Frances recognized it before reading. For several minutes, she let it lie unopened on the small writing desk in the blue room. Rain tapped softly against the window. Richmond smelled of wet earth and coal smoke, not Mayfair wax and perfume. Here, no one had placed her at the far end of a table. No one had crossed out her name. She broke the seal at last. "Miss Wraxley, I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, and I do not ask for it. I write because silence has already been used too often against you. At the subscription room, I hesitated to speak the whole truth, because I feared making a charge before all proof was secured. That fear wore the costume of prudence, but it repeated the injury done to you. Scandal made me cautious. My caution made scandal stronger. I am ashamed of it." Mr. Holbury continues to trace the wax. "Lady Elvington has informed me that you are safely received in Richmond, and I am relieved only insofar as relief does not presume any claim upon you. Mrs. Nettle's security remains protected. No action involving your prayer book, the pearl or the vellum, will be taken without your permission. If you choose never to answer this letter, I will still proceed to correct the wrong I helped make public. Daneford." Frances read it once, then again. The letter did not warm the room. It did not mend the clasp, restore her name, or undo the sight of Lucian's hand lifting toward her in a room where he still did not fully stand with her. But it did something rarer than apology. It refused to bargain. No plea, no claim, no graceful arrangement by which she could comfort him for having wounded her. Mrs. Nettle entered with the old copybooks wrapped in brown paper. "Cousin Margaret says these may be locked in her escritoire if you wish." Frances touched the letter. "Not yet." The nurse hesitated. "There's something more, miss. I remembered it on the road, but I didn't like to speak with the driver so near." Frances looked up. Mrs. Nettle untied the copybook bundle and opened Flora's childhood book to the back pages, where girlish exercises gave way to lines copied in a more deliberate hand. There were phrases from Mrs. Wraxley's old inscriptions. "Hold yourself with dignity. Never mistake obedience for peace." Frances stared. Flora copied Mamma's words, more than once. "After your Mamma died, Miss Flora used to come into the schoolroom when she thought no one saw. She said she wanted to write as prettily as you. But it was your hand she practiced, miss. Yours and your mamma's turns of phrase. Frances felt the room grow very still. The false renunciation had not merely borrowed her name. It had tried to borrow the moral shape of her mother's language. That was why the lie had hurt before she knew its words. Somewhere inside it, a thief had dressed fraud in her mother's voice. She folded Lucian's letter and placed it inside her reticule beside the copied practice sheet. She would not answer him tonight. She was not ready to give him even a line of herself, but she kept the letter. Not as forgiveness, as evidence of a man beginning, perhaps, to understand that belief delayed could become another form of betrayal. Mrs. Nettle watched her. What shall we do now? Frances looked toward the rain-dark garden, where Richmond's lilacs bent under water and did not break. We will not go to Bath, she said. We will not return, because they summon us. And when His Grace finds where his wax came from, we will be ready to ask why my mother's words were needed to make their lie sound true. The road to Hampshire taught Frances that distance did not always soften pain. Sometimes it merely gave pain more windows through which to look back. She travelled from Richmond in Lady Elvington's carriage, with Mrs. Nettle beside her and Mr. Holbury riding in a second carriage with his dispatch case, while Lucian followed on horseback for the first stage and then took a seat opposite the solicitor when rain made the roads slick with chalk and clay. Propriety had been arranged with almost military care. Lady Elvington sat near Frances whenever they stopped. Mrs. Nettle slept in the room next to hers at the posting inn. Lucian never spoke with Frances alone, never entered a room before Lady Elvington, never touched a parcel, paper, or latch that might be called hers. Yet his restraint did not make him distant. It made his attention harder to dismiss. When the inn parlour fire smoked, he asked the maid to move Mrs. Nettle's chair away from the draught before the old nurse began to cough. When Frances removed her gloves to smooth the copybook pages, he turned his gaze to the window until she had finished. When Mr. Holbury spoke of the alleged renunciation, Lucian did not say the paper. He said the paper used against Miss Wraxley, and Frances, who had not answered his apology letter, heard the difference. Hampshire received them under a low grey sky, with hedgerows silvered by rain and fields spreading green beneath clouds, heavy enough to make the whole county appear to be holding its breath. The parish church stood on a rise beyond the village, its square tower damp with weather, its yews black against the spring grass. Frances had been baptized there. Her mother had married there. The childhood memorandum between Wraxley and House Elvington had been witnessed there because Mrs. Wraxley, though gentle in manner, had trusted parish records more than drawing-room assurances. Frances had not understood that wisdom until now. The rector, Mr. Ashcombe, was an elderly man with kind eyes and a voice that treated paper as a moral responsibility. He received them in the vestry, where the air smelled of old wood, wool, cloaks, and dust warmed by a small coal fire. Mrs. Wraxley was most particular, he said, unlocking the parish chest with a key he wore on a ribbon beneath his waistcoat. She said family promises are often remembered by those who benefit from them and misremembered by those who suffer under them. Frances felt Mrs. Nettle's hand press briefly against the back of her chair. Lucian stood near the closed vestry door with Lady Elvington in clear view, his face unreadable except for the tension in his jaw. Sir Clement did not know they had arrived this early. That had been Lady Elvington's doing. Respectability, she had said at breakfast, is most useful when it reaches the truth, before a liar reaches the witness. Mr. Ashcombe lifted out a bundle tied in faded tape and laid it on the table. Mr. Holbury opened his dispatch case, but did not touch the parish papers until the rector nodded. Frances watched the tape come loose. She had expected a document dry with legal phrasing, a relic of fathers and settlements and dutiful daughters. Instead, the first page bore her mother's hand in a line added beneath the formal witness text. No daughter shall be bound without her living consent. Frances did not move. She read the sentence once, then again, as if the words might change if she blinked. No daughter shall be bound without her living consent. All her life, she had thought her mother had left her a promise, a burden wrapped in tenderness, a path she was expected to walk beautifully because affection had once blessed it. But here, in ink that had outlived gossip, pressure, death, and treachery, her mother had left her a door. She insisted upon that clause, Mr. Ashcombe said quietly. Sir Clement considered it unnecessary. Mrs. Wraxley said unnecessary protections are often the only ones women are allowed to keep. Frances' throat closed. She had not wept at the chapel. She had not wept when her name was crossed from the widow's list. She had not wept when leaving Wraxley House. But this was not humiliation. This was love arriving late, carrying proof in both hands. Lucian took one step forward, then stopped. He had learned. Frances felt the space he left for her grief, and because he did not rush to fill it, she could breathe inside it. "May I stand with you?" he asked. The question was low enough that only those at the table heard. It did not ask to comfort her. It asked where he was permitted to be. Frances looked at his hand, not extended this time, like rescue, but open at his side, waiting. She thought of the altar of the pearl bead, of his hand lifting too soon in the subscription room and falling when she refused him. She thought of his letter, with its unadorned shame. Then she reached across the narrow space and placed her gloved hand in his. His fingers closed gently around hers. He did not draw her closer. He did not speak. The hand-holding lasted through the rector's careful turning of the second page, through Mr. Holbury's soft intake of breath as he compared the seal marks, through Mrs. Nettle's quiet sob, and through Frances' first tear falling onto the back of her own glove. Lucian's hand remained steady, not claiming, not urging, only present. "Your mother did not sell your future," he said softly. "No," Frances whispered. "Everyone else merely behaved as if she had." His fingers tightened once, barely, including me. She did not answer. Forgiveness was not a reflex to be triggered by remorse. But she did not remove her hand. That was answer enough for the moment. Mr. Holbury bent closer to the memorandum. The original promise is clear. Miss Frances Wraxley was named, but the consent clause makes any alleged later renunciation highly significant. If genuine, it should have been recorded with witness and date. If false, the attempt was not only a substitution, it was an effort to manufacture her consent. "And the wax?" Lucian asked. Mr. Holbury compared a notation with the sheet from his dispatch case. "The original Daneford wax was used here and in copies kept by both families. If old wax remained at Wraxley House, it could have been softened and misapplied. The colour on the alleged renunciations resembles this seal, but the impression lacks the depth of a proper matrix." Frances looked at the parish seal, then at the empty place in the logic where one object remained missing. "The attendance slip," she said. Mr. Ashcombe frowned. "Attendance slip. At Lady Marescote's dinner, Mrs. Viley said her ladyship's clerk keeps copies for weddings tied to charity patronage and special licenses." The rector's expression sharpened with memory. There was a clerk from Lady Marescote's office in the chapel vestry that morning. I thought it odd. He claimed to be confirming donation acknowledgements for the Widows' Fund. I recall seeing him copy a chapel slip after the ceremony failed. Did he copy who entered the vestry before the service? Mr. Hulbury asked. He should have. Such slips note attendance, witnesses, and access when private arrangements are involved. Lucian's hand did not move, but Frances felt him go still. If Flora was near the vestry before I arrived, the slip may show it. Or if Sir Clement's footman delivered the vellum there, Frances said. She released Lucian's hand slowly. He let go at once, though she sensed the loss pass through him. Before anyone could speak further, the vestry door opened without ceremony. Sir Clement stood in the doorway, wet from travel and white with fury. Behind him, the churchwarden hovered in distress, clearly having failed to prevent the intrusion. How industrious, Sir Clement said. My daughter runs from her father's house and returns to rifle parish records under ducal protection. Frances stood. Her tear had dried cold on her glove. I returned to read what Mamma protected. Your mother is dead. The words were meant to end the matter. Instead, they seemed to wake every witness in the vestry. Mrs. Nettle rose halfway from her chair. Lady Elvington's eyes became glacial. Lucian stepped forward, but not in front of Frances, beside her. Sir Clement, he said, you will moderate your tone in this church. Sir Clement laughed once. You presume much for a man who rejected one daughter and now toys with restoring her. Frances turned to Lucian before he could answer. No. He looked at her. She kept her gaze on his. Let me. The pause that followed was small, but everything important in their strange, damaged connection seemed to gather inside it. Then Lucian bowed his head. As you wish. Frances faced her father. You told me Bath would restore my sense. Mamma's record has done it more quickly. I know now that the original promise did not bind me without consent, so if someone produced a renunciation, they were not freeing me. They were forging the very choice Mamma made sure belonged to me. Sir Clement's face tightened. You understand nothing of family necessity. I understand that necessity has become your favorite name for theft. His eyes flicked to Mr. Hulbury's papers. Too fast. Too late, the rector closed the parish bundle with calm authority. These records will remain in this chest. Certified extracts may be prepared under proper witness. Mr. Hulbury nodded, and I shall seek Lady Mariscote's clerk regarding the chapel attendance slip. Sir Clement's jaw worked. You will regret making private sorrow public. Frances looked at the page one last time before the rector tied the bundle again. No daughter shall be bound without her living consent. No, Papa, she said. I regret only that public lies made private truth necessary. The rain had stopped when they left the church. The ewes dripped quietly. Frances paused on the path, drawing the damp air into her lungs. Lucian stood a few feet away, close enough to be present, distant enough to leave her free. I learned something today, he said. She looked at him. About the record? Her guard rose, but he did not try to pass it. My father taught me that duty was safer than affection. Affection made men weak, he said. Duty could be recorded, enforced, inherited. I believed him for too long. Frances looked toward the carriage where Lady Elvington waited. Duty did not make you cruel, no. Fear did. Fear of disorder. Fear of scandal. Fear that if I asked what you wanted, I might have to hear an answer that no settlement could manage. The honesty was quiet. It asked nothing of her. That was why it reached her. My mother gave me a choice, Frances said. Everyone else called it an inconvenience. Lucian's face softened with pain. Then we will make it evidence. She did not smile. Not yet. But when he offered his arm for the walk to the carriage, he did not presume. He waited. Frances looked at the wet path, then at his sleeve, then placed her hand lightly upon his arm. It was not the sustained hand-holding of the vestry. It was not forgiveness. It was a decision to continue. Behind them, the church door closed on the parish chest, and the words her mother had left alive. Ahead, the missing attendant's slip waited somewhere in Lady Mariscote's world of polished charity and profitable silence. Lady Mariscote's next invitation arrived folded in cream paper, sealed with lavender wax, and phrased as if public disgrace were merely another form of good breeding. Frances read it in Cousin Margaret's Richmond parlour, while rain tapped at the window and Mrs. Nettle sat beside the hearth with her sewing untouched in her lap. The Committee for Widows' Relief, Lady Mariscote wrote, would reconvene in 3 days to settle recent misunderstandings that had cast discomfort upon several respectable families. Discomfort. Frances looked at the word until it lost all politeness. A bride left standing at the altar was discomfort. A mother's prayer book cut open was discomfort. A woman's consent forged, crossed out, and discussed over tea was discomfort if the room was expensive enough. Cousin Margaret took the invitation when Frances handed it to her and read it with a widow's contempt for elegant cruelty. She means to finish you where she began. No, Frances said. She means to finish the story before the evidence arrives. Mrs. Nettle's needle trembled between her fingers. Then you mustn't go, Miss Frances. Let His Grace and Mr. Holbury handle the papers. You need not put yourself before those women again. Frances turned toward the window. Richmond's wet garden bent under spring rain, each lilac branch dark and shining. She had been safer here. She had slept without listening for her father's footstep outside the door. She had taken breakfast without Flora's wounded eyes measuring how much sympathy could be stolen from a silence. Safety had been pleasant. It had also begun to feel like a room someone else might one day lock from the outside and call peace. If I do not go, Frances said, they will say I feared the conclusion. Let them, Mrs. Nettle whispered. I've heard what they say. It isn't worth your heart. It is not my heart they are judging. It is my name. And names, once surrendered to rooms like hers, do not return because one waits politely. Before Mrs. Nettle could answer, a carriage stopped outside. Lady Elvington entered soon after, bringing with her the clean scent of rain and Mayfair discipline. She removed her gloves, accepted no tea, and looked directly at Frances. Lady Mariscote's clerk has been approached. Frances rose. And frightened men rarely lie well on the first attempt. He claims you requested the guard leaf removed for sentimental reasons after the failed wedding. Mrs. Nettle made a sound of outrage. Lady Elvington continued. He also claims he saw Miss Flora nowhere near the vestry. Frances held herself still. Then he has been instructed. Yes, Sir Clement visited him before Mr. Holbury could. Cousin Margaret muttered, Of course he did. There is more, Lady Elvington said. Mr. Holbury obtained a stationer's note. The vellum used for the alleged renunciation was purchased after the date written upon it. Not by name, naturally, but by description. A Wraxley footman, with payment recorded to Sir Clement's account. Frances felt the room sharpen. That proves the date false. It proves the paper could not have carried the old date honestly. It does not yet prove who cut your prayer book or who placed the paper in Lucian's hand. Lucian. Lady Elvington used his Christian name rarely. When she did, it made the Duke sound less like a title and more like a man who could be wounded by his own conscience. Frances looked down at the invitation. Will he ask me not to attend? Lady Elvington's mouth tightened. He wishes to. That is not what I asked. No, he will not ask. He is learning. But the lesson is not comfortable. At that moment, a second letter was brought in, this one bearing Daneford's seal. Frances broke it, while the others watched, though she could feel Mrs. Nettle's hope that the letter would command her into safety. It did not. Miss Wraxley, Lady Marescote, has arranged the committee to make a public conclusion out of private pressure. I would spare you the ordeal if sparing did not too closely resemble removal. Mr. Hulbury has secured the stationer's note. Lady Elvington believes the attendance slip still exists, though not where the clerk claims it should be. If you choose to attend, I will stand where you place me. If you choose not to attend, I will still present the evidence. I want to prevent your pain. I am beginning to understand that wanting is not authority. Daneford. Frances read the last line twice. I am beginning to understand that wanting is not authority. It did not mend what had happened. It did not absolve the hesitation in the subscription room. When his hand had lifted before his belief had become brave enough. But it named the thing. Men of rank were rarely trained to name the border between care and command. Lucian had found it and written it down. Frances folded the letter. I will attend. Mrs. Nettle covered her mouth. Lady Elvington studied Frances for a long moment. Then we must decide how. With evidence. And with witnesses, Lady Elvington said. The rector's certified extract will arrive tomorrow, Mr. Hulbury has the stationer's note. The wax comparison is ready. Mrs. Nettle can speak to the missing guard leaf and the paper knife. Mrs. Nettle paled but straightened. I can. Frances crossed to the small writing desk and unlocked the drawer where she kept Flora's copied practice sheet. And this shows she practiced my name. Lady Elvington took it, her face hardening. This will help, but it may also allow Flora to claim childish imitation. She will. Then we need the slip, the attendance slip, the small record from the chapel that might place Flora where she insisted she had not been, somewhere in Lady Marescote's world of ledgers and lavender wax. A clerk had copied it, hidden it, or surrendered it. Frances imagined Flora's music portfolio at Wraxley House, always carried to gatherings when she wished to look accomplished, always stuffed with songs she rarely practiced, and papers she did not want servants to see. The thought arrived without proof, but with the force of recognition. Flora hid distress inside pretty things. Reticules, handkerchiefs, music. Lady Elvington, Frances said. Does Flora still attend Marescote's evenings with her music? Often. Lady Marescote admires a weeping girl at a pianoforte. Then ask what portfolio she carries. Lady Elvington's brows lifted. You suspect the slip is with her? I suspect Flora keeps what frightens her near enough to control and pretty enough to pass unseen. For the first time that day, Lady Elvington smiled. It was not a warm expression. It was a strategic one. My dear, you are becoming dangerous. Frances thought of the altar, the broken clasp, the line across her name on the subscription card. No, I am becoming accurate. 2 days later, at Daneford House, Frances met Lucian with Lady Elvington, Cousin Margaret, Mrs. Nettle, and Mr. Hulbury present. The damaged prayer book rested before Frances, brought from Wraxley House under Lady Elvington's protection and never out of Frances's sight. The pearl bead remained in Lucian's evidence box beside the vellum. He stood across the table from her, not at its head. That was the first thing she noticed. He had left the head chair empty. Lady Marescote will expect me to speak first, he said. Then disappoint her, Frances replied. His eyes met hers. Gladly. Mr. Holbury spread the evidence with careful economy. We can show the cut edge, the wax residue, the later stationer's note, the handwriting practice, the parish memorandum with consent clause. But if the clerk lies, Sir Clement may still claim Miss Wraxley removed her own guard leaf and later regretted it. He will, Frances said. He has always preferred claims that make obedience look like mercy. Lucian's hand rested near the velvet evidence box, not touching it. Not touching her prayer book. I could prevent the meeting. Frances looked at him. He did not flinch, but she saw him regret the words as soon as they were spoken. Could you? She asked. By rank, yes. And would you prevent every room where my name is repeated without me? Silence. Then he drew a slow breath. No, I would only make a larger room for the same lie. She nodded once. Then do not save me from the room. Stand in it properly. He came around the table, still leaving space between them. Tell me where. Frances heard the quiet weight beneath the words. Not flirtation, not surrender. Trust offered as obedience to her boundary, the strangest tenderness of her life. Beside me, she said, not before me, not over me. If I tremble, let me tremble. Do not make steadiness the price of being believed. His face changed. Something in him gave way, not dramatically, but permanently. Yes, not before you, not over you, beside you, if you still permit it. The room seemed to fall very still around them. Frances felt no touch, yet the moment had the intimacy of one. He had asked for no reward, she gave none, but she did not look away. I permit it for the truth, she said. No more than that. The question was soft and dangerous because it carried pain without demand. Frances held his gaze. Do not ask me for what you have not yet repaired. He bowed his head. I will not. Before anything more could be said, Lady Elvington entered from the adjoining morning room. Rain silvered the shoulders of her cloak. In her gloved hand, she held a folded paper, creased twice, faintly smudged, and marked with the chapel clerk's notation. Miss Flora Wraxley's music portfolio was left at Mariscote House after yesterday's rehearsal, she said. Lady Mariscote's maid was persuadable by rank and terrified by conscience. Mr. Holbury rose. The attendant's slip. Lady Elvington laid it on the table, folded between the Bluebells of Scotland and a song about betrayed innocence. Flora has dreadful taste in both music and concealment. Frances did not laugh. She could not. The slip lay before her, small, official, and devastating. Lucian looked at it, then at Frances, waiting. She picked it up herself. The ink recorded attendance, witnesses, vestry access, and times. Near the line marked before ceremony, one name stood clear. Miss Flora Wraxley, admitted through side vestry with Sir Clement's footman. Frances closed her eyes for 1 second. Not from weakness, from the force of a door opening at last. When she opened them, Lucian was still beside her, exactly where she had placed him. Now, she said, we go back to Lady Mariscote's room. Lady Mariscote had never intended her subscription room to contain truth. It had been built for softer things, folded pledge lists, murmured influence, charitable names written in elegant columns, and the quiet purchase of moral superiority by women who preferred their mercy supervised. On the morning Frances returned, the long windows stood open to a pale sky, and the room smelled of ink, violets, candle wax, and fear disguised as lavender water. The patronesses had gathered early. Lady Mariscote sat at the head of the table, with her ledgers arranged before her like shields. Sir Clement stood near the hearth, one hand tucked inside his coat, his expression grave enough to suggest that the family sorrow had exhausted him. Flora sat beside him with her music portfolio nowhere in sight, which told Frances more than its presence would have done. Lucian entered with Frances, not before her. Lady Elvington followed, then Mr. Holbury, cousin Margaret, Mrs. Nettle, and at last the chapel clerk, a thin young man whose complexion suggested he had not slept since discovering conscience could not be folded and hidden like a receipt. Frances felt the room appraise the arrangement. They had expected a duke to lead. They had expected the injured lady to be carried in by rank, shielded by masculine authority, restored by someone else's power. Instead, Frances walked to the table first and placed her damaged prayer book upon it with her own hands. The broken clasp lay visible against the worn leather. Its empty pearl socket faced the room like an eye that had seen too much. Lucian stopped half a pace behind and beside her, exactly where she had placed him at Daneford House. He did not touch the book. He did not speak first. Lady Marescote's smile thinned. "Miss Wraxley, Your Grace, this gathering concerns a charitable committee, not a family prosecution." Frances looked at the crossed-out place card still lying among the papers. "My name was crossed from that charity in this room. If the wound was public enough for your ink, the correction may be public enough for your ears." Mrs. Wraxley gave a dry little cough that might have been approval. Lady Marescote coloured, but Sir Clement stepped forward before she could answer. "Frances, this performance can only degrade you further." "No, Papa," Frances said. "It can only clarify who was degraded first." Lucian's breath shifted beside her. He still said nothing. Mr. Holbury opened his folder. "With Miss Wraxley's permission, I will present the sequence." Frances nodded. "Begin with the object they used." He lifted the alleged renunciation, sealed in a protective wrapper. "This vellum was delivered to His Grace on the morning of the interrupted wedding. It bears Miss Wraxley's name and old Daneford wax. It claims she renounced the childhood promise some years ago and permitted another daughter to be considered." Flora's lashes trembled. "I never wanted this humiliation reopened." Frances turned to her. "Then you should not have helped close it over me." A murmur passed down the table. Mr. Holbury laid a sketch of the prayer book's cut edge beside the vellum. "The vellum matches a gourd leaf removed from this prayer book. The cut is clean and consistent with a narrow paper knife." Mrs. Nettle saw the gourd leaf present on the night before the ceremony. Mrs. Nettle rose, pale but steady. "I did. I fastened the clasp myself. There was no wax on it then." Mr. Holbury opened a small box and displayed the wax flake taken from the hinge. Blue wax residue was later found in the broken clasp. It corresponds in color and age to Daneford wax used in the original family memorandum. Lucian then placed the velvet-lined evidence box on the table and opened it. The single pearl bead rested inside, pale and accusing. "This bead fell when the clasp broke at the altar," he said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the room more completely than anger would have done. "I picked it up after Miss Wraxley had been forced to leave the chapel alone." Forced. Frances heard the word. So did the room. Sir Clement's jaw tightened. Mr. Holbury continued. "The hinge caught the wax because the false vellum was likely pressed near the clasp while the wax was still soft. We also possess a stationer's note indicating vellum of this size and quality was purchased after the date written on the alleged renunciation." Lady Marescote lifted her fan. "A suggestive chain, perhaps. But suggestion is not guilt." "No," Frances said. "That is why we brought the slip." Lady Elvington stepped forward and placed the chapel attendant's slip on the table. Flora's face changed. No tears came this time. Her eyes fixed on the paper with such naked dread that every patroness saw it before she remembered to look wounded. Mr. Holbury read aloud. Before the ceremony, access to the vestry was recorded for Sir Clement Wraxley's footman and Miss Flora Wraxley. The clerk swallowed. His hands shook. I copied that slip for Lady Mariscote's office. She keeps records when chapel donations connect with patronage lists. Sir Clement later told me it would be best to misremember the time. He said no one would thank me for stirring a bride's hysteria. Lady Mariscote snapped her fan shut. Mr. Pike, you will not imply my office knowingly concealed evidence. The clerk looked at her, then at Frances, and seemed to choose terror's better master. No, my lady, I imply I was afraid of Sir Clement and ashamed before Miss Wraxley. Sir Clement moved so quickly towards speech that his anger seemed almost physical. This boy is confused. Lucian spoke then. Take care. 2 words, not loud. The room obeyed them. Sir Clement turned on him. You would accept the word of a clerk over that of a father. Lucian looked at Frances before answering, not to seek rescue, but to remember his place. I once accepted paper over the character of the woman it condemned. That was my failure. I will not repeat it, because the liar now wears paternal concern. The words struck the room harder than any evidence yet. Lady Mariscote looked away first. Frances felt them enter her as pain and steadiness together. He had not merely defended her. He had named himself. He had not turned his error into romance or his remorse into a claim upon her. He had placed his fault where everyone could see it. Flora rose suddenly. Papa said it was only to prevent scandal. Sir Clement's face went grey. Sit down. Flora did not. He said Frances had already had years of being the important one. He said the Duke needed a wife who would not question every arrangement. He said consent was only a word men put into settlements to please dying women. The room froze. Frances's hand closed over the edge of the table. Her mother's line seemed to echo from the parish chest to this lavender-scented room. No daughter shall be bound without her living consent. Sir Clement reached for Flora's arm, but Lucian stepped into his path without touching either of them. You will not silence her. Frances looked at Flora. Did you cut the guard leaf? Flora's mouth trembled. I held the book while Papa's man softened the wax. I used the knife. I thought if the paper looked old enough, no one would ask you. No one ever asks the quiet person first. There it was. Not full confession yet. Not all of it, but enough to crack the room open. Lady Mariscote whispered, This is most unfortunate, Mrs. Viley said. No, my lady. This is most overdue. The air became too close. Frances stepped back from the table, not because she was weak, but because the truth had weight. The prayer book, the pearl, the wax, Flora's voice, Lucian's public shame, all of it pressed against her until she could not draw a clean breath. She moved toward the side gallery, where the door stood open to a narrow passage lined with old charity portraits. She did not flee. She simply chose a place where the room could not feed on her face. Lucian did not follow at once. She heard that pause and knew what it cost him. Then Lady Elvington's voice, low and precise, said, She has turned toward the gallery, Lucian. Wait for her eyes. Frances looked back. Lucian stood at the threshold, not entering. May I? He asked. Such a little question, such an enormous repair. Frances let the silence hold for one breath, then another. Then she stepped toward him. That was her answer before her voice found the rest. Yes. He entered only far enough to meet her beneath the open doorway, visible to Lady Elvington, and removed from the worst of the room. Frances did not collapse against him. She placed her hands lightly against his coat, felt his breath stop, and then his arms came around her with careful restraint. The embrace was brief, proper, and devastating. He held her as if she were not broken, as if she were not evidence, as if she were not a promise gone wrong, but a woman who had stood too long alone and had finally permitted one person to stand close enough to feel tremor. "I am sorry," he said near her temple, so softly only she could hear. "Not for being caught wrong, for being wrong when you needed belief." Frances closed her eyes. She did not forgive him entirely. Not yet. But her fingers tightened once in the fabric of his coat before she let go. When she stepped back, he released her at once. In the subscription room, Flora's voice rose again, shaking and young and trapped. "Father told me consent was only a word men put into settlements." Frances turned back toward the table with Lucian. Beside her, the embrace already gone from their bodies, but not from the air between them. The public truth had begun. It had not finished. Flora's words did not fade when she finished speaking. They hung over Lady Mariscote's subscription room like smoke from a candle no one dared snuff. "Father told me consent was only a word men put into settlements." Frances stood beside the long table, with Lucian half a pace back, the place she had chosen for him, and watched every face attempt to rearrange itself around the truth. Lady Mariscote's mouth had gone stiff. Mrs. Vayoley looked openly grim. The chapel clerk stared at his own hands as if they had betrayed him into honesty. Sir Clement stood near the hearth, no longer grave, no longer paternal, but sharpened by the panic of a man whose mask had cracked in public. Flora pressed both palms against her skirts, breathing quickly. She looked younger than her guilt and older than her tears. Frances did not pity her enough to forget what she had done. She pitied her just enough to understand how a daughter trained to crave a father's approval might mistake theft for survival. "Say all of it," Frances said. Flora's eyes flew to hers. "Frances, don't. You asked London to believe I had spoken when I had not. Now speak where they can hear you." Sir Clement stepped forward. "You will be silent, Flora." Lucian moved only enough to block his path. He did not touch Sir Clement. He did not need to. No daughter in this room will be commanded into silence again. Lady Mariscote rose. "Your Grace, surely this has exceeded the limits of charity business. You made Miss Wraxley's reputation charity business when you crossed her name from your list." Lady Mariscote flushed. Lucian's gaze did not leave Sir Clement. "It will remain charity business until the woman wronged here has been publicly corrected." Frances looked at Flora. "The guard leaf." Flora's chin trembled. "Papa said the old promise was useless if your consent clause could be raised. He said Daneford might withdraw rather than risk scandal over a daughter who had been taught to think too much. So he invented my consent after stealing it." Flora covered her face for one moment, then lowered her hands. "I cut the guard leaf from Mamma's prayer book with the ivory-handled paper knife. I practiced your name from the old copybooks. Papa's man softened old Daneford wax from the seal kept at Wraxley House. I held the vellum while the wax was pressed. I did not write the entire paper. Papa dictated most of it. But I wrote your name." Mrs. Nettle began to cry quietly. Frances heard it and kept standing. "And the chapel?" Mr. Holbury asked. Flora looked toward the attendance slip as if it might answer for her. "I went through the side vestry before the ceremony. The footman brought the folded vellum. Papa said His Grace would receive it before he could ask Frances anything. He said a duke would never risk marrying a woman who had rejected him in writing." Lucian's face changed, but he did not look away from the truth he had helped empower. "He was nearly right," he said. The words were low. They cut him as much as anyone else. Flora swallowed. "I thought once you refused Frances, everything would settle." Papa said the families could amend the arrangements. Lady Mariscote would help society understand. I thought, if I could be calm enough, grateful enough, pretty enough, no one would ask why I was ready. And when I did not marry you, Lucian said, you continued the lie, because it was all I had left. Flora looked at Frances then, and the envy in her was exhausted enough to become almost honest. You had even your suffering nobly. I had only the place you would not value. Frances felt the old wound pull tight, but it did not rule her. You never knew what I valued, because you never asked. None of you asked. The chapel clerk rose shakily. I must add, Your Grace, Miss Wraxley, that Sir Clement instructed me to misdate an entry after the wedding failed. He said, if I did not, Lady Mariscote's committee would learn I had kept irregular copies for private patrons. He promised to ruin my position. Mr. Halberry placed the stationer's note beside the renunciation copy. The paper was purchased after the date written upon it. The clerk's admission confirms pressure. The attendant slip places Miss Flora Wraxley in the vestry. The cut edge, wax residue, pearl clasp, copied signatures, paper knife, and parish memorandum complete the chain. Lady Mariscote sank back into her chair as if the ledgers had withdrawn their loyalty. Sir Clement made one last attempt at command. This is family disorder, not fraud. A father may arrange the welfare of his daughters. Frances turned to him. For the first time in her life, he seemed smaller than the authority he had borrowed from fatherhood. A father may guide, he may advise, he may even disappoint. He may not cut a dead woman's prayer book, forge a living woman's consent, and sell one daughter's name to advance another. A murmur moved through the room, not gossip now, but judgment. Sir Clement looked to the patronesses and found no refuge. Lucian stepped forward enough that his rank filled the space Sir Clement's authority had abandoned. Sir Clement Wraxley, Mr. Halberry will record the fraud and the coercion of the clerk. No claim by your house upon Daneford will be entertained. No engagement to Miss Flora Wraxley exists. No settlement advantage will pass through this deception. If you attempt to remove Miss Wraxley by force, by medical pretense, or by any other polite cruelty, you will discover how public I am, willing to make every paper in this room. Sir Clement's lips thinned. You speak as if she belongs to you now. Lucian went very still. Then he turned to Frances before the entire room. No, he said. That is the first truth I should have known. Miss Wraxley belongs to herself. Frances felt the room shift again, not because a duke had defended her, but because he had refused possession when possession would have been the easiest answer society understood. Lucian faced Lady Mariscote. You will restore Miss Wraxley's name to the widow's relief list and retract the gossip you encouraged. Lady Mariscote's pride made one last flicker. I never named her publicly, Mrs. Fairley said. Then your retraction will be as clever as your slander. Several patronesses murmured agreement. Lady Mariscote took up her pen with a hand that shook only slightly, and drew a fresh card from the stack. Miss Frances Wraxley. The letters looked small after all she had survived, but Frances watched them appear with an ache so deep it had no tears left. Lady Mariscote placed the card at the head of the corrected list. The committee regrets any premature conclusion. No, Frances said. The pen stopped. Regret is not correction. Write that the alleged renunciation was fraudulent, that I did not withdraw my consent, and that my name was suspended without evidence. Lady Mariscote stared at her. Lucian did not speak. He let the demand remain Frances's own. At last, Lady Mariscote wrote. When it was done, Mr. Halberry sanded the ink and took custody of the statement. Flora sat down as if her strength had run out through the confession. Sir Clement would not look at her. That, more than any punishment, made her flinch. Frances saw it, but she did not go to her. Mercy could come later, not before truth had finished its work. Lucian opened the velvet box and lifted the single pearl bead. He held it out upon his palm, the same careful distance he had kept outside the chapel carriage. Only you may decide whether it belongs on the clasp again. Frances looked at the pearl, then at the man holding it. The subscription room, with all its witnesses, seemed to fall away until there was only the space between his hand and hers, filled now not by proof, but by choice. She took the bead. Their gloves brushed lightly. This time, neither pretended not to feel it. Lucian drew a breath. Before these witnesses, I release you from every childhood promise between Wraxley and Daneford. I do not ask you to restore what I broke as if you were damaged property returned to its place. I ask only, when time and your own will permit it, for leave to court the woman I should have heard before every seal in England. Frances closed her fingers around the pearl. I will not be restored like damaged property. No, his voice softened, and, for the first time, all his restraint trembled. I love you, Frances, not as the bride promised to me, not as a wrong I must repair, but as the woman whose consent I should have honored before every seal in England. The words reached her after the room had already heard them, and yet they felt private because nothing in them claimed repayment. Frances had imagined love once as a quiet reward for duty. She knew better now. Love, if it was worthy, stood beside truth and waited to be chosen. I love yous, Lucian, she said, and his face changed as if the sentence had struck the guarded place in him that no title had ever entered. But I come to you freely, or I do not come at all. Freely, he said, or not at all. The room remained still. Even Lady Mariscote seemed to understand that no fan should move. Lucian's eyes held hers. May I kiss you? Frances stepped toward him. Not because anyone restored her. Not because a duke offered rank. Because, after silence, shame, evidence, and public truth, her own heart had become another thing no one else would sign for her. Yes, she said. The kiss was gentle, brief, and utterly without claim. His gloved hand did not seize hers. His mouth touched hers with reverence, then withdrew before propriety could turn tenderness into display. Yet in that restrained moment, Frances felt the altar transformed. She had not been chosen over another woman. She had chosen herself, and from that freedom, she had chosen him. When Lucian stepped back, he bowed to her first, not to the room. Around them, the patronesses rose one by one. Mrs. Vaylley wiped her eyes with no embarrassment at all. Lady Elvington's face held triumph tempered by tenderness. Sir Clement stood ruined in the silence he had once used as a weapon. Flora wept without performance now. Frances placed the pearl bead beside her mother's prayer book and rested her hand over the broken clasp. It was not repaired, not yet, but it was hers, and the room that had tried to erase her had heard her say so. 3 months after Lady Mariscote wrote Frances's correction with a trembling hand, the chapel at Briarcombe Park opened its doors to a morning so quiet that even happiness seemed to enter on careful feet. It was not the London chapel, with its polished cruelty, crowded pews, and witnesses hungry for a misstep. This chapel stood at the edge of Daneford's country estate, built of pale stone, softened by ivy, with clear glass windows that looked toward wet lawns, and a line of beech trees turning silver in the early summer light. The guests were few by design. Lady Elvington sat in the first pew, composed and bright-eyed. Cousin Margaret Annesley wore grey silk and an expression that warned the world she would never again confuse gentleness with weakness. Mrs. Nettle held a handkerchief already damp before the service began. Mr. Holbury stood near the vestry with the new marriage settlement folded in his case, its language plain and deliberate. It acknowledged Frances's free consent, preserved her personal dignity, secured proper independence within the bounds of marriage, and made no secret of the fact that the Duchess of Daneford would enter her husband's house as a woman, not a corrected transaction. Sir Clement was not present. His credit had collapsed with the story he had tried to sell, and the men who once bowed to his confidence now examined his accounts with colder interest. Flora had been sent to a respectable aunt in Norfolk, where there were fewer mirrors for wounded innocence and fewer rooms in which to practice being admired. Before she left London, she sent Frances a note with no plea in it, only one sentence written in her own hand. "I don't know who I am when I'm not taking what you had." Frances had read it once and put it away. Mercy, she had learned, did not require forgetting. Lady Mariscote's influence survived in fragments, as influence often did, but her patronage no longer moved unchallenged through Mayfair drawing rooms. Mrs. Valley had made certain of that with the persistence of an old widow who had discovered the pleasure of being difficult in public. Corrected cards had gone out. The Widows' Relief Committee restored Frances's name, then discovered that restoration required more than ink. It required listening when she spoke. Through all of it, Lucian had courted her with a restraint that asked daily what grand apologies could not repair at once. He called at Richmond with Lady Elvington. He walked beside Frances in Margaret's garden, and never mistook conversation for permission to manage her future. He sent books, but not instructions, flowers, but not spectacle, and one morning the small velvet box containing the pearl bead with a note that said only, "For the clasp, if you wish it." Frances had waited 2 days before taking it to a jeweller recommended by Lady Elvington. The clasp was repaired now, not made new. Frances had insisted on that. The broken hinge had been strengthened, the pearl restored, and the old blue wax cleaned, only after Mr. Holbury recorded every trace. Yet the clasp no longer locked tightly. It closed with a gentle pressure and opened with one touch. When the jeweller apologized for the imperfection, Frances had smiled. "No," she said, "that is exactly right." Now she stood at the chapel door with the prayer book in her hands, wearing ivory silk again, though this gown bore no resemblance to the one made for a bargain. This one had been chosen slowly. She had refused one design because it made her look like an ornament, another because the bodice reminded her of her father's preference for women who could not breathe too deeply. Lady Elvington had said nothing, merely summoned the dressmaker again. Frances's veil was light. Her gloves were plain. Her mother's prayer book rested against her palms, the repaired pearl clasp cool beneath her fingers. For a moment she thought of the London aisle and the pearl rolling away from her into public silence. Then Lucian turned at the altar and saw her. There was no lateness this time, no folded lie in his hand, no sister waiting in white, only Lucian Elvington, Duke of Daneford, standing before the clergyman with his face stripped of every cold defence, except the effort not to love her too visibly before propriety allowed it. When Frances began to walk, no one whispered. Mrs. Nettle sobbed once and pretended it was a cough. Lucian's eyes did not leave Frances's face. He did not look at the prayer book first, not the clasp, not the symbol of the wound. He looked at her as if she had arrived not to complete his honor, but to answer a question he had finally learned how to ask. At the altar, he bowed slightly. "Miss Wraxley," he said softly, and there was enough memory in the title to make them both feel the distance between this morning and the first. Frances looked at him. "Your Grace." His mouth curved, barely. "For the last time, I hope, if you behave with sense." The clergyman, who had been carefully pretending not to hear, turned a page with sudden interest. Lucian's eyes warmed. The service began. When the question came, it did not frighten her. "Wilt thou have this man?" Frances had been trained for years to think that the answer had been settled before she was old enough to understand it. Her mother's memorandum had said otherwise. Her own suffering had proved the cost of forgetting. She looked at Lucian, at the man who had once believed a paper over her silence and had since spent every day learning that love could not be sealed into existence. "I will," she said, not because 2 houses required it, not because scandal had been repaired, because she did. Lucian's answer came low and steady. "I will." When the vows were done and the ring rested on her hand, the chapel did not erupt. It breathed. That was better. Lucian held her gloved fingers as they turned from the altar, and this time the contact did not ask whether she could stand. It acknowledged that she already had. Outside, the morning had brightened. The small party moved toward the house, where breakfast waited, and calling cards from once silent acquaintances sat in careful stacks upon a salver. Frances knew she would receive some and ignore others. Duchess of Daneford was a title, not an obligation to reward cowardice. In the garden, after the necessary congratulations, she slipped away to the bench beneath the copper beech, where rain still clung to the leaves. Lucian found her there, stopping several steps away. Even now, after vows, he waited. Frances held out her hand. "You may come nearer, Lucian. I did marry you. I am taking nothing for granted. Good." He sat beside her. For a little while, they watched sunlight touch the wet grass. Then Frances turned to him and, because she wished it, placed both hands lightly against his coat and leaned into his arms. This embrace was no longer brief, because witnesses required it. Yet it remained gentle, safe, and wholly hers to begin. Lucian held her with the reverence of a man entrusted, not rewarded. He kissed her gloved hand first, over the ring, then bowed his head and pressed a tender kiss to her brow. Frances closed her eyes. No room watched, no lie waited, no one else's will stood between her heart and her voice. "I love you freely," she said. Lucian's breath caught, and his arms tightened only enough to answer without claiming. "Freely is the only vow I trust." She smiled then, fully, and he looked almost undone by it. Later, when they returned to the house, Frances placed her mother's prayer book on the small table in the morning room beside the open calling card tray, prepared for her first receiving day as Duchess of Daneford. Lady Elvington had arranged the cards in neat order. Mrs. Fairley's lay on top, of course, with a note demanding tea and reform in equal measure. Frances laughed softly. Lucian stood behind her, close but not crowding, while she touched the pearl clasp. It closed with a gentle click. One pearl restored, one hinge strengthened, one book able to shut without imprisoning what it held. Frances opened it again with one touch, and her mother's inscription waited inside, no longer hidden by a stolen guard leaf, no longer needed as proof against a lie. "Hold yourself with dignity, my darling. No title can give you that, and no title may take it away." Frances laid her hand over the page. Then she turned to Lucian, who looked not at the title she now carried, but at the woman who had chosen to carry it. Outside, Briarcombe Park shone under the clean after-rain light, and the repaired pearl clasp rested beside the open tray. closed without locking, exactly as it should be. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.